Hello everyone! Tonight I've prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now let's begin. The night I took the wrong turn into Dead Man's Pass from Big Mike, I've been hauling freight across this country for near about 25 years now. And I've seen just about everything you can imagine out on these lonely highways. I've driven through blizzards so thick I couldn't see my own hood, survived ice storms that turned the interstate into a skating rink, and pushed through heat waves that made the asphalt shimmer like water. But nothing, and I mean nothing, ever shook me quite like the night I took that wrong turn into Dead Man's Pass. It was late October, somewhere around 2 in the morning, and I was running a load of refrigerated goods from Minneapolis down to Oklahoma City. The dispatcher had given me a tight deadline, and I was already running a few hours behind because of construction delays outside of Des Moines. You know how it is when you're trying to make up time. Your mind gets a little fuzzy, your eyes start playing tricks on you, and you're not paying quite as much attention as you should be to the road signs flashing by in the dark. I was somewhere in northern Missouri, cruising through an area I thought I knew pretty well, when I saw what looked like a shortcut on my GPS. Now, I usually don't trust those things completely because they've led me down some questionable roads before. But this route promised to shave off nearly 40 minutes from my trip, and I was desperate to make up that lost time. The turnoff came up quick. Just a narrow 2-lane road that split off from the main highway and disappeared into a dense forest of pine and oak trees that seemed to swallow up the moonlight. The road was darker than I expected, with no street lights and barely any reflectors on the sides to guide me. My headlights cut through the blackness like twin searchlights, illuminating nothing but endless pavement and the occasional glimpse of tree trunks pressing in from both sides. There was something about the way those trees looked, all twisted and gnarled like arthritic fingers reaching toward the sky, that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I told myself I was just tired, that my mind was making things seem worse than they were, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a terrible mistake. About 10 minutes into the shortcut, I noticed that my CB radio had gone completely silent. Now that's not entirely unusual in remote areas where you're out of range of other truckers, but what was strange was the static. It wasn't the normal crackling white noise you get when there's no signal. It was this low, rhythmic pulsing sound, almost like breathing. I reached down to adjust the squelch, thinking maybe I could clear it up. But the moment my fingers touched the dial, the sound stopped completely, leaving nothing but an eerie, oppressive silence. That's when I saw the sign. It was old, so old that the paint had faded to barely visible letters, and it was leaning at a dangerous angle like it might topple over at any moment. But I could still make out the words etched into the weathered wood. Dead Man's Pass, next 2 miles, travel at your own risk. My foot instinctively eased off the accelerator, and I felt my heart start to hammer in my chest. I'd heard stories about places with names like that. Roads where truckers had disappeared without a trace, where accidents happened with suspicious frequency, where the laws of nature seemed to bend and break in ways that defied explanation. I should have turned around right then and there. Should have backed up my rig and gotten the hell back to the main highway. But something kept me moving forward. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was stubbornness. Or maybe it was just the professional instinct that tells you to complete the job no matter what. Whatever it was, I kept my hands on that wheel and continued down that godforsaken road, deeper and deeper into whatever darkness was waiting for me. The trees seemed to close in tighter as I drove, their branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out even the faintest starlight. My headlights seemed weaker somehow, like they were struggling to penetrate the thick shadows that clung to everything. I could feel the temperature dropping inside the cab, even though my heater was running full blast, and my breath started coming out in little white puffs that hung in the air before dissipating. That's when I started seeing the crosses. They lined both sides of the road, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all made of rough-hewn wood and painted white, though the paint was peeling and flaking away with age. Some had names carved into them, Some had dates, but most were blank. Just anonymous markers for people who had met their end on this stretch of forgotten highway. I counted them as I passed, trying to keep my mind occupied, trying not to think about what each one represented, but I lost count somewhere around 75. The road began to twist and turn, winding through the hills in a serpentine pattern that forced me to slow down to a crawl. My truck's engine was groaning with the effort of navigating the steep grades and sharp curves, and I could hear the cargo shifting slightly in the trailer behind me despite the load locks and straps. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to stop, to turn around, to get away from this place, but the road was too narrow now, with sheer rock faces on one side and deep ravines on the other, leaving me no choice but to keep moving forward. Then I saw it, standing in the middle of the road about 100 yards ahead, illuminated in the weak glow of my headlights. At first I thought it was a person, just someone standing there in the darkness, maybe a stranded motorist or a hitchhiker looking for a ride. But as I got closer, as the details became clearer, I realized that whatever it wasn't human. It was tall, impossibly tall, at least 8 or 9 feet from what I could tell, and it was just standing there, completely motionless, staring directly at my truck with eyes that reflected my headlights like an animal's would. I slammed on my brakes, and my truck shuddered to a stop with the screech of air brakes and the smell of burning rubber. The thing didn't move, didn't react at all to my sudden stop. It just continued to stand there, watching me with those terrible glowing eyes. I could see now that its proportions were all wrong. Arms too long, legs too thin, head tilted at an angle that would have broken a normal person's neck. It wore what looked like the tattered remains of old clothes, but I couldn't make out any other details through the darkness and the distance. My hand moved to the air horn, and I gave it a long, loud blast, hoping to scare whatever this thing was off the road. The sound echoed through the pass, bouncing off the rock walls and filling the night with noise. But the figure didn't even flinch. It just stood there, and then, slowly, deliberately, it raised one long arm and pointed directly at me. Or maybe at something behind me, I couldn't tell. I looked in my side mirrors, trying to see what it might be pointing at, and that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The crosses I'd passed, all those white markers lining the road, they were glowing now, emanating a soft, sickly green light that pulsed in rhythm with that breathing sound I'd heard on my CB radio earlier. And they weren't just glowing. They were moving, swaying back and forth like they were being blown by some unfelt wind. When I looked back at the road ahead, the figure was gone. Just vanished like it had never been there at all. But in its place, the road itself had changed. Where there had been solid pavement just moments before, now there was nothing but a gaping chasm. A black void that seemed to swallow all light, with no bottom that I could see. My truck was perched right at the edge, with my front tires barely 2 feet from the drop-off. I don't know how I did it, but somehow I managed to throw my truck into reverse and back up without jackknifing or sliding off the narrow road. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel, and sweat was pouring down my face despite the cold. I backed up for what felt like miles, not daring to take my eyes off that impossible void in the road, until finally I found a wide enough spot to turn around. Getting out of Dead Man's Pass took twice as long as getting in, and every second of it was pure terror. The crosses continued to glow and sway. The temperature continued to drop until I could see frost forming on the inside of my windows, and my CB radio crackled to life with voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize, saying things I couldn't understand, but that filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. When I finally emerged back onto the main highway, the sun was just starting to rise, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. My truck was covered in a fine layer of frost, even though it was nowhere near cold enough for that to happen naturally. And when I checked my dashboard, I discovered that nearly 6 hours had passed, even though the entire ordeal had felt like maybe 30 minutes at most. I pulled into the first truck stop I found and sat there in the parking lot for a long time, just trying to process what had happened, trying to convince myself that it had all been some kind of hallucination brought on by exhaustion and stress. But when I got out to do my walk-around inspection, I found deep scratches running along the entire length of my trailer. 4 parallel gouges that looked like they'd been made by something with claws the size of railroad spikes. I never reported what happened that night, never told my dispatcher why I was so late making that delivery, never filed any kind of incident report or insurance claim. Who would believe me anyway? I've gone back to that area a few times since then. Always in daylight, always with other trucks around trying to find that turnoff, trying to prove to myself that Dead Man's Pass really exists. But I've never been able to find it again. It's like that road just disappeared, or maybe like it only exists at certain times under certain conditions, waiting for the next driver foolish enough to take a wrong turn in the middle of the night. These days, I stick to the main highways even if it takes longer, even if it costs me money and fuel and time, because I learned something that night in Dead Man's Pass. Something that every veteran trucker knows deep in their bones but rarely talks about. There are roads in this country that don't follow the normal rules. Places where the boundary between our world and something else grows thin. And if you're not careful, if you don't pay attention to the warnings and trust your instincts, you might find yourself somewhere you can never come back from. And that's a risk I'm not willing to take ever again. The rest stop hidden in the pines from Diesel. Dan, I've pulled into more rest stops than I can count over the years. From the fancy new ones with their clean bathrooms and well-lit parking areas, to the run-down old ones with nothing but a couple of picnic tables and an outhouse that smells like something died in it. They're all pretty much the same, really. Just places to stretch your legs, take care of business, maybe grab a quick nap before pushing on to wherever you're headed. But there's one rest stop I stumbled across about 7 years ago that I still think about. That still gives me nightmares. And that I've never been able to find again no matter how many times I've driven that same stretch of highway. It was late summer, middle of August if I remember right, and I was hauling a load of construction equipment from Portland down to Sacramento. I'd been on the road for about 8 hours straight, pushing through the heat of the day, and I was starting to feel that familiar fatigue settling into my bones. That heaviness in my eyelids that tells you it's time to pull over before you become a danger to yourself and everyone else on the road. The problem was I was in the middle of a long, desolate stretch of highway that cuts through the Cascade Range. Miles and miles of dense forest with hardly any services or facilities. I was just starting to resign myself to pulling onto the shoulder and taking a break in my cab when I saw the sign. It was small, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. Just a standard brown rest area sign with the universal symbols for parking, restrooms, and picnic areas. What struck me as odd was that I'd driven this route dozens of times before and had never noticed this particular rest stop. But I wasn't about to question my good fortune. I needed a break. There was a rest stop. Problem solved. The exit ramp was narrow, barely wide enough for my truck, and it curved sharply away from the highway before disappearing into the trees. As soon as I left the main road, the sound of traffic faded away completely, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to press in from all sides. The trees here were enormous ancient pines and firs that must have been growing for centuries, their trunks as thick as my trailer, and their branches forming a canopy so dense that it blocked out most of the late afternoon sunlight. The air smelled strongly of pine needles and damp earth, with an underlying odor of something else, something organic and slightly unpleasant that I couldn't quite identify. The access road wound through the forest for what felt like at least a mile, which seemed excessive for a rest area, but I figured maybe it was situated in a particularly scenic spot that was worth the drive. The pavement under my tires was cracked and weathered, with weeds pushing up through the gaps and pine needles piled in thick drifts along the edges. It didn't look like it had been maintained in quite some time, which should have been my first warning sign, but I was tired and not thinking clearly. When I finally emerged into the rest area proper, I was surprised by how large it was. There was a big parking lot, big enough for at least 20 or 30 trucks, all neatly marked with faded white lines. In the center of the lot stood a large building, Probably the restroom facility made of dark wood that looked like it had been stained, or maybe just aged to that color over time. There were picnic tables scattered around under the trees, trash cans placed at regular intervals, and even a couple of those informational signs that usually have maps and local wildlife information on them. But the place was completely empty. Not a single other vehicle in the entire parking lot. No maintenance workers, no other travelers, nobody. Just me and my truck and all those empty parking spaces. I told myself that wasn't necessarily strange, that I was in a pretty remote area and it was midweek, so traffic would be light. But something about the scene made me uneasy, made that little voice in the back of my head whisper that maybe I should just turn around and head back to the highway, find somewhere else to stop. I ignored that voice like an idiot and pulled my truck into one of the parking spaces closest to the restroom building. As soon as I killed the engine, the silence became even more pronounced. There were no bird sounds, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, no distant traffic noise, nothing. Just an oppressive, heavy silence that seemed to muffle even my own breathing. I sat there in my cab for a moment, looking around, trying to figure out what was bothering me so much about this place. That's when I noticed the condition of the building. Up close, I could see that it was in serious disrepair. The wood was rotting in places, with chunks missing here and there, and some of the windows were broken, with jagged pieces of glass still clinging to the frames. The door hung slightly crooked on its hinges, and when a slight breeze pushed it open a few inches, I heard the shriek of rusty metal that sent shivers down my spine. The whole place had the look of somewhere that had been abandoned for years, maybe decades, which made no sense at all because there was that official rest area sign out on the highway, and this place was clearly marked on those informational signs I'd seen. I climbed down from my cab, my boots crunching on the gravel-strewn pavement, and stretched my back, feeling my spine pop in several places. The air was cooler here under the trees than it had been out on the highway, and there was a dampness to it that made my clothes feel slightly clammy against my skin. I walked toward the restroom building, still thinking I'd just use the facilities and get back on the road. But with each step I took, that feeling of wrongness grew stronger. The door to the building was unlocked, which I suppose made sense for a public rest area, and it swung open with a long, drawn-out creak that echoed through the empty parking lot. Inside was dark, much darker than it should have been given that it was still daylight outside, and I had to wait a moment for my eyes to adjust. There was a strong smell of mildew and decay, and something else underneath it, something sweet and cloying that made my stomach turn. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust and pine needles that had blown in through the broken windows, and I could see footprints in the dust, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all leading deeper into the building. I followed those footprints with my eyes, watching as they led down the hallway toward where the actual restrooms would be, and that's when I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. The footprints weren't all the same size. There were large ones, small ones that looked like they'd been made by boots, others that looked like bare feet, some that didn't look quite human at all, with proportions that were just slightly off in ways I couldn't immediately identify. And they were all going into the darkness of that hallway, but none of them came back out. I stood there in that doorway for a long moment, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and leave, to get back in my truck and drive away as fast as I could. But there was also a part of me, a curious part that I wish I could silence, that wanted to know what was down that hallway, what had happened to all the people who'd made those footprints, where this place really was and why it felt so wrong. I took one step into the building, then another, following those footprints deeper into the shadows. The hallway seemed longer than it should have been, stretching on and on into darkness that my eyes couldn't penetrate. The walls were covered in old posters and notices, park regulations and emergency contact numbers, but all the dates on them were wrong, going back decades, some of them to the 1960s and 70s. There were also photographs, dozens of them, tacked to the walls with rusty thumbtacks, and as I looked at them I felt a chill run down my spine. They were pictures of people, families and individuals and groups of friends, all posed in front of this very building or at the picnic tables outside, all smiling and happy, completely unaware of whatever horror this place held. But there was something wrong with the photographs too. In every single one, no matter when it was taken or who was in it, there was a figure in the background, always partially hidden behind a tree, or standing in a shadow, or just at the edge of the frame. You could never see it clearly, never make out any details, but you could tell it was watching the people in the photograph, waiting for something. And in the most recent photographs, the ones that looked like they might have been taken in the last few years, that figure was getting closer, moving from the background to the middle ground, getting larger and more defined with each picture. I was so focused on those photographs that I almost didn't hear the sound at first. It was faint, coming from somewhere deeper in the building, a soft rhythmic thumping like footsteps on old floorboards. But these footsteps didn't sound quite right. Didn't have the pattern of normal walking. It was more of a dragging shuffle, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. And it was getting closer, moving toward me down that dark hallway from somewhere I couldn't see. That's when I finally listened to my instincts and ran. I turned and bolted back toward the entrance, my boots pounding on the dusty floor, my heart hammering in my chest. Behind me, I could hear that dragging sound speed up, could hear something pursuing me, getting closer with each second. I burst through the front door and into the parking lot, gasping for air, and sprinted toward my truck. But when I looked back at the parking lot, my truck wasn't where I'd left it. In fact, the entire parking lot looked different. The pavement was older, more cracked, covered in even more debris. The building behind me looked worse, more decayed, like years had passed in the few minutes I'd been inside. And worst of all, the parking lot wasn't empty anymore. There were vehicles there now, dozens of them. Cars and trucks from different eras, from the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s, all parked neatly in their spaces, all covered in layers of dust and pine needles, all sitting on flat tires with rust eating away at their bodies. My truck was there too, but it looked different, looked old, like it had been sitting abandoned for years instead of minutes. The tires were flat, the paint was faded and peeling, and when I looked through the window, I could see that the interior was covered in mold and mildew. The seats rotted through, the dashboard cracked and broken. This wasn't possible, couldn't be possible. But I was seeing it with my own eyes, watching my truck age decades in the span of seconds. I heard the door of the building creak open behind me, heard that dragging, shuffling sound emerge into the parking lot, and I didn't look back. I just ran into the forest, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face and arms, not caring where I was going, just trying to get away. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would give out. Ran until I couldn't hear that terrible dragging sound anymore. Ran until I burst out onto the highway, nearly getting hit by a passing truck whose horn blared at me as it swerved around my stumbling form. I stood there on the side of the road, gasping and shaking, covered in scratches and pine needles, trying to process what had just happened. When I looked back toward where I'd come from, I couldn't see any break in the trees, couldn't see any sign of the access road I'd driven down, or the rest area that shouldn't exist. It was just solid forest, thick and impenetrable, like there had never been anything there at all. A highway patrol officer found me about 20 minutes later, stopped to check if I was okay, probably thinking I was drunk or having some kind of medical emergency. I told him I'd gotten lost in the woods, didn't mention the rest stop or what I'd seen, and he gave me a ride to the nearest truck stop where I could call for help. When I reported my truck stolen, even though I knew it wasn't really stolen, the police could never find any trace of it. It was like it had simply vanished, along with that impossible rest area. I eventually had to buy a new truck, had to explain to my insurance company what had happened, though I left out most of the truth. And I've driven that same stretch of highway dozens of times since then, always in daylight, always paying careful attention to every sign and landmark, trying to find that rest area again, trying to prove to myself that it was real and not just some hallucination or mental breakdown. But I've never seen that sign again. Never found that narrow access road winding into the forest. Never found any evidence that the place existed at all. And sometimes late at night when I'm driving through the darkness, I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for the next tired driver to stumble across it, adding another vehicle to its collection. Another set of footprints to that dusty floor that leads into the shadows but never comes back out. The woman who walked out of the woods and asked for a ride from Rusty Joe. There are unwritten rules out on the road, codes that truckers follow without really thinking about them, lessons learned over years of experience and passed down from one generation of drivers to the next. Don't pick up hitchhikers, especially not in the middle of nowhere. Don't stop for someone waving you down unless you can see a legitimate emergency. Don't trust anyone or anything that seems too convenient, too lucky, too good to be true. I'd followed these rules religiously for 30 years, never once deviating, never once taking a chance that didn't need to be taken. Until the night I picked up the woman who walked out of the woods on Highway 47 and learned why those rules exist in the first place. It was deep winter, late January, and I was hauling a load of electronics from Chicago to Denver, taking the northern route through Iowa and Nebraska because the southern route was closed due to ice storms. The weather was brutal, with temperatures well below zero and a wind that cut through even the warmest clothing like a knife. Snow was falling steadily, not heavy enough to really slow me down, but enough to make the roads treacherous and visibility poor, forcing me to keep my speed low and my attention focused. I was somewhere in western Nebraska, in the middle of that vast, empty stretch where there's nothing but frozen farmland stretching to the horizon in every direction, when I saw her. She was standing on the side of the road, right at the edge of where my headlights could reach, wearing nothing but a thin summer dress that whipped around her legs in the brutal wind. No coat, no hat, no shoes that I could see. Just that flimsy dress and skin that should have been blue with cold, but instead looked perfectly normal, perfectly healthy, like she was standing in pleasant spring weather instead of a sub-zero blizzard. My first instinct was to keep driving, to follow those rules I'd learned over decades of experience. But something made me slow down instead. Maybe it was the impossibility of what I was seeing. Maybe it was simple human compassion, or maybe it was something else. Something I still don't fully understand. How could anyone survive out here in these conditions dressed like that? Where could she have possibly come from? There were no houses, no vehicles, nothing but empty road and frozen fields for miles in every direction. I brought my truck to a stop about 50 yards past where she was standing and sat there for a moment, watching her in my side mirror. She didn't move at first, didn't wave or call out or show any sign that she'd even noticed I'd stopped. She just stood there, perfectly still, that dress whipping around her in the wind, her hair long and dark and flowing despite the conditions. Then slowly she began walking toward my truck, moving with a strange gliding motion that didn't quite look like normal walking, like her feet weren't quite making contact with the ground. Against every instinct, against all those rules and years of experience, I reached over and unlocked the passenger door. I told myself I was just going to ask her some questions, find out what she was doing out here, maybe call for help if she needed it, but I wouldn't actually let her in the truck, wouldn't actually give her a ride. But when she reached the door and pulled it open, when that blast of freezing air hit me along with a smell like autumn leaves and old earth, when she looked up at me with eyes that were completely black, no whites at all, just solid darkness that reflected my cab lights like polished stone, I found that I couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but watch as she climbed up into the passenger seat and closed the door behind her. The temperature in the cab plummeted the moment she was inside, and I could see my breath coming out in great white clouds despite the heater running full blast. She sat there in the passenger seat, hands folded in her lap, that summer dress now hanging still and undisturbed even though the wind outside was still howling. She was beautiful in a way that was almost painful to look at, with features that seemed too perfect, too symmetrical, like something created rather than born. and she smelled like the deep woods, like moss and mushrooms and decomposing leaves. A smell that shouldn't have been there in the middle of winter on the frozen plains. "Thank you for stopping," she said, and her voice was like wind through pine branches, soft and sibilant and somehow sad. Not many people do anymore. Not many people can see me at all these days. I tried to ask her where she was going, where she'd come from, what she was doing out here in the middle of nowhere in the dead of winter wearing nothing but that thin dress. But my voice wouldn't work properly. The words came out slurred and slow like I was talking through molasses, and she just smiled at me. A smile that didn't quite reach those black eyes. "Just drive," she said. "Keep going the way you were going. I'll tell you when to stop." And so I drove. Because I couldn't think of any reason not to. Because those eyes seemed to look right through me into some deep part of my brain that controlled my actions without consulting my conscious mind. My hands turned the wheel and worked the shifter. My feet operated the pedals. And my truck rolled forward through the snow while I sat there like a passenger in my own body, watching everything happen but not quite participating in it. She didn't say anything for a long time. Just sat there staring out the windshield at the darkness and the snow, occasionally tilting her head like she was listening to something I couldn't hear. The cab was still freezing despite the heater, and I noticed that frost was forming on the inside of the windows, creating intricate patterns of ice crystals that looked almost like writing in some language I didn't recognize. The radio had gone to static, but if I listened carefully, I could hear voices in that static faint and far away, speaking words I almost understood but couldn't quite grasp. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes, she spoke again. "Do you know what I am?" she asked, still staring out at the darkness. I tried to shake my head, tried to say no, but all I could manage was a slight movement that might have been a shrug. She laughed, a sound like wind chimes made of bone, hollow and eerie. "No, I suppose you wouldn't. Nobody knows anymore. Nobody remembers the old stories, the old warnings. You've forgotten how to see what's really there, forgotten how to recognize the signs." She turned to look at me then, fully turned in her seat, and I could feel the weight of her gaze like a physical pressure on my chest. "I'm what happens when the forest takes back what was taken from it," she said. "I'm what's left when someone dies alone in the woods and nobody ever finds them, when they're forgotten and left to rot among the leaves and the mushrooms. I'm the anger and the sorrow and the loneliness, all mixed together and given form and purpose. And I walk these roads now, looking for the ones who took, for the ones who destroyed, for the ones who forgot." I wanted to tell her that I wasn't one of those people, that I'd never destroyed anything, never taken anything that wasn't mine, but the words still wouldn't come. She smiled again, reading my thoughts somehow. "Oh, I know you didn't, not directly, but you benefit from it, don't you? You drive on roads built through forests that were cut down and cleared away. You haul goods made from trees that were harvested and processed and turned into products. You eat food grown on land that was once wilderness. You're complicit whether you know it or not, whether you chose it or not." She reached out then, and her hand was cold. So cold it burned where it touched my arm, cold enough that I could feel frost forming on my skin beneath my sleeve. "But I'm not going to hurt you," she said. "Not tonight. Tonight I just need a ride. Need to get somewhere I can't reach on my own. And in exchange for this ride, I'm going to tell you something. Give you a warning that you need to hear. Will you listen?" I managed to nod, the motion jerky and uncoordinated, and she seemed satisfied with that. "The world is changing," she said. "The boundaries are breaking down. The walls between what is and what was, between the mundane and the magical, between the living and the dead. Places like where you found me, they're becoming more common, thin spots where things can cross over that shouldn't be able to, and there are more of us now. More things like me, more spirits and shades and old forgotten horrors waking up after centuries of sleep. The roads you travel aren't safe anymore, not like they used to be. There are places you can go that you'll never come back from. Turns you can take that lead nowhere good. Rest stops and gas stations and motels that exist in the cracks between reality and nightmare." She turned back to face forward, and I felt some of that pressure ease off my chest, Felt like I could breathe a little easier. Watch for the signs, she continued. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, if something seems off, don't ignore it just because you can't explain it. The old rules, the old superstitions, they existed for a reason, and that reason is becoming relevant again. Don't pick up hitchhikers. Don't stop at places that seem too empty or too convenient. Don't trust anything that offers you exactly what you need at exactly the right time. And most importantly, don't forget that the woods remember. The land remembers, and sooner or later, everything that was taken will be reclaimed. Just ahead, I could see lights. The glow of a small town that I hadn't known was there, that I couldn't remember seeing on my GPS when I'd planned this route. Stop here, she said, and my foot moved to the brake, slowing the truck as we approached what looked like an ordinary rural intersection, the kind you can find in hundreds of small towns across the heartland. But when I looked closer, I could see that something was wrong with this town, that the buildings were too old, the streets too narrow, the whole place having a quality like an old photograph, faded and unclear around the edges. She opened the door and climbed down, moving with that same strange gliding motion, and stood there in the snow looking up at me. Thank you for the ride, driver, she said. Remember what I told you. Remember that there are things in this world that you don't understand, that you can't explain, that won't fit into your rational modern worldview. And remember that just because you can't see something doesn't mean it isn't there, watching you, waiting for you, following you home down these dark and lonely roads. Then she turned and walked away, not toward the town, but away from it, back toward the darkness and the trees that shouldn't have been there on these flat plains, but were somehow present anyway, a line of ancient forest that I hadn't noticed before. I watched her go, watched her dissolve into the shadows like she'd been made of mist. And when I looked back at the town, it was gone too. Nothing but empty road and darkness stretching ahead of me. The heater kicked back on with a roar and warmth flooded the cab. My voice came back. My control over my own body returned, and I sat there shaking and gasping, trying to process what had just happened. On the passenger seat where she'd been sitting was a pile of dead leaves and a few mushrooms, and the smell of the deep woods lingered in the air. Anne scratched into the frost on the passenger window. In letters that were already starting to melt were 3 words. The woods remember. The frozen town with all the lights still on. From highway. Hank, you'd think after 40 years of driving these highways I'd have seen just about everything, that nothing could surprise or frighten me anymore. I've driven through natural disasters. I've seen accidents that'll haunt me until my dying day. I've witnessed the worst that humanity has to offer and occasionally glimpsed the best. But there's one run I made about 5 years ago that stands out above all the rest. One night that challenged everything I thought I knew about reality and what's possible in this world. It was the night I drove through Ashfield, the frozen town where time itself seemed to have stopped, where all the lights were still on but nobody was home, where something terrible had happened that I still don't fully understand. It was mid-December, and I was hauling a load of winter supplies from Minneapolis to Boise, taking one of those back roads that cuts through Montana, because I'd heard reports of black ice on the interstate, and I figured the smaller highway would be safer, even if it took longer. The weather was getting worse as evening turned to night, with heavy snow starting to fall and the temperature dropping fast enough that I could feel it even inside my heated cab. The road I was on was narrow and winding, cutting through forests and small valleys, with hardly any traffic and even less in the way of services or facilities. Around 9 o'clock at night, with the snow really coming down hard and visibility dropping to maybe 50 feet, I came over a rise and saw lights in the valley below. It was a town, not a big one, probably no more than a few hundred residents, but the sight of it was incredibly welcome after hours of driving through empty wilderness. Every window in every building was lit up, warm yellow light spilling out into the snowy darkness, and I could see streetlights illuminating roads and parking lots, Christmas decorations hanging from lampposts, even what looked like a lit-up nativity scene in front of a church. It looked cozy and inviting, like a postcard or a painting of small-town America at its most idyllic. What struck me as I started down the hill toward the town was how bright it was, how every single light seemed to be on, not just in houses and businesses, but in every building I could see, even ones that looked like they might be barns or storage facilities. There wasn't a single dark window, not one unlit building, which seemed unusual, even accounting for it being evening during the holiday season. But I was cold and tired and getting worried about the weather, so I was just grateful to find a place where I might be able to stop and wait out the worst of the storm. As I drove into the town, past a sign that read, "Welcome to Ashfield, population 312, established 1886, I noticed something else that seemed off. The streets were completely empty. Not a single person walking around, not a single vehicle moving, no one shoveling their sidewalks or clearing off their cars despite the heavy snowfall. But all those lights were on in every building, bright and warm behind windows that showed fully furnished interiors, with lamps lit and Christmas trees, decorated and tables set as if people had just stepped away for a moment and would be right back. I drove slowly down what appeared to be the main street, looking for any sign of life, any indication of where everyone might be. There was a grocery store with its open sign illuminated, a diner with what looked like fresh food visible through the windows, a gas station with all its pumps lit up and ready to use, even a small movie theater with its marquee advertising current releases. Everything looked normal, looked active, looked like a functioning town going about its evening business. Except there wasn't a single person anywhere. And as I drove, I realized I couldn't hear anything either. No sound of music or television from the houses. No barking dogs, no distant traffic noise, nothing but the rumble of my own engine and the hiss of my tires on the snowy pavement. I pulled my truck into the parking lot of that diner, thinking maybe everyone was inside there. Maybe there was some kind of community event or meeting that would explain why the streets were deserted. As soon as I killed my engine, the silence became even more pronounced. So complete and absolute that it felt like a physical pressure on my eardrums. Snow was falling all around me, thick and heavy, but it fell without sound, settling on everything in an ever-deepening blanket that was already several inches thick, despite the fact that, according to the weather report I'd heard before I lost radio signal, it had only started snowing in this area about an hour ago. I climbed down from my cab and walked toward the diner, my boots crunching in the snow, each footstep echoing strangely in the silence. Through the window I could see tables and chairs, a counter with stools, a kitchen visible behind a pass-through window, and food sitting on plates at several of the tables like someone had been in the middle of eating when something interrupted them. There was steam rising from a cup of coffee, which should have been impossible given how cold it was and how long the food had clearly been sitting there. But I could see it as clear as day, little wisps of vapor curling up into the air. I tried the door, and it opened easily, setting off a small bell that jangled in the silence. I called out asking if anyone was there, but my voice just echoed and died, swallowed up by that oppressive quiet. I stepped inside and the warmth hit me immediately, the heater clearly running and working fine, maintaining a comfortable temperature inside the diner. But that just made everything more unsettling because it meant that all these systems, heating and electricity and presumably water and everything else, were still functioning, still being maintained somehow, despite the obvious absence of any people. I walked through the diner slowly, looking at the abandoned meals, the half-drunk cups of coffee and soda, the pie sitting in a display case that looked freshly baked, the cash register that was on and showing a transaction in progress that hadn't been completed. On one table, there was a newspaper dated to 3 days ago, folded open to the local news section. On another, a child's coloring book lay open with crayons scattered around it, a drawing half finished. Everything suggested that people had been here recently, had just stepped away or been interrupted in the middle of their normal activities. but there was no indication of where they'd gone or why they'd left everything behind. In the kitchen, I found food in the middle of being prepared, a pot of soup on the stove still warm, vegetables halfway through being chopped on a cutting board, an oven with something baking inside that filled the air with the smell of fresh bread. I turned off the stove in the oven, some automatic instinct to prevent a fire, and that's when I noticed my reflection in the shiny surface of the refrigerator. Behind me, visible in that distorted reflection, I could see shapes moving in the diner, figures sitting at the tables standing behind the counter, moving through the space like they were going about their business. But when I spun around to look directly, there was nothing there. Just empty tables and chairs and that suffocating silence. I left the diner quickly, back out into the snow and the cold, and stood in the parking lot trying to figure out what to do. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to get back in my truck and leave this place as fast as possible. But another part, the curious part that's gotten me into trouble more times than I can count, wanted to explore more, wanted to understand what had happened here. So I walked down the street, looking into windows, trying doors, searching for any clue that might explain the mystery of Ashfield. Every building was the same story. Lights on, heat running, everything looking lived in and active, but not a single person anywhere. In the grocery store, there were shopping carts in the aisles, some with food already in them, abandoned mid-shopping trip. In the gas station, the pumps were ready, but nobody was there to run them. And inside the convenience store section, the cash register was open with money still in it, making the place a potential target for robbery if there'd been anyone around to rob it. In the houses I looked into, I saw dinner tables set for meals that had never been eaten, television still on and playing to empty rooms, beds unmade like people had just gotten up that morning and never come back. At the church, the one with the nativity scene out front, I found the doors unlocked and went inside. The sanctuary was set up for a service with hymn books laid out on the pews, flowers on the altar, candles lit and burning despite the obvious fire hazard of leaving them unattended. In the office, I found a calendar with appointments and events scheduled weeks into the future, all written in neat, careful handwriting that suggested someone had been planning for a future they apparently never got to experience. And on the pastor's desk, there was a journal lying open, the last entry dated to the morning of the day I arrived. I read that entry, and what I found there chilled me more than anything else I'd seen in Ashfield. It described a normal day, morning coffee and breakfast, plans to visit some parishioners who were ill, thoughts about the upcoming Christmas service. But then toward the end, the handwriting got shaky, less controlled, and the words became more frantic. It described a feeling of being watched, of sensing something wrong in the town, of looking out the window and seeing something in the woods around Ashfield, something large and dark and moving with purpose toward the town. The last line, written in letters so hard-pressed that they'd almost torn through the page, simply said, "It's here. God help us, it's here." I left the church and looked toward the woods surrounding the town, trying to see what the pastor might have seen, what might have caused such terror. The trees were dark and dense, covered in snow, but in the spaces between them, in the shadows and the darkness, I thought I could see movement, shapes that were too big to be animals and moved too deliberately to be tricks of the light. And the more I stared, the more I became convinced that those shapes were moving, slowly but steadily, forming a ring around the entire town, a circle of darkness that was gradually contracting. That's when I noticed something else, something I should have seen earlier but had somehow missed. The snow inside the town limits was accumulating, getting deeper with each minute that passed, but it wasn't falling evenly. It was deeper around the edges of town, piled up in drifts that got higher the closer you got to the tree line, like something was pushing it inward, compressing it, using it to gradually bury the town, and the temperature was dropping rapidly, much faster than natural weather patterns would explain, cold so intense that I could feel it seeping through my heavy coat, freezing the moisture in my nose and throat with each breath. I ran back to my truck, slipping and sliding on the increasingly icy pavement, and climbed into my cab with my heart pounding and my hands shaking. I started the engine, threw it into gear, and headed back the way I'd come, toward the road out of town and away from whatever was happening here. But as I drove, I looked in my mirrors and saw something that made my blood run cold. The lights in Ashfield were going out one by one, starting from the edges and moving toward the center, darkness swallowing the town street by street, building by building, until there was nothing left but blackness and snow. I drove for hours, pushing my truck as hard as I dared on the icy roads, not stopping until I was well clear of that area and the sun was starting to rise. When I finally felt safe enough to pull over and rest, I tried to look up Ashfield on my GPS and phone maps. Tried to find any information about the town I'd just left, but there was nothing. No town by that name anywhere in Montana. No record of it ever existing, not even any geographic features that matched the valley where I'd found it. It was like the place had been erased, wiped from maps and records and memory, leaving nothing behind but my own recollection and the fear that still makes my hands shake when I think about it. To this day, I don't know what happened in Ashfield, whether it was some kind of supernatural event or mass disappearance or something else entirely beyond my understanding. I don't know if those people are dead or displaced to somewhere else, whether they're trapped in some other reality or simply ceased to exist. All I know is that somewhere in Montana, or maybe in some dimension that overlaps with our reality, there's a frozen town where all the lights are on, where time stopped one ordinary morning in December, where something came out of the woods and took away everyone and everything, leaving behind only empty buildings and unanswered questions that will haunt me for the rest of my days. The CB signal that came from underground, from Silent Sam. They call me Silent Sam because I don't talk much on the CB radio, never have been one for the constant chatter that some drivers seem to need to pass the time on long hauls. I prefer to keep to myself, listen to music or audiobooks, enjoy the solitude and the rhythm of the road. But I always keep my CB on, always monitor Channel 19, because you never know when you might need help or when someone else might need yours. And that radio can be a lifeline when you're hundreds of miles from anywhere. I just never expected that lifeline to reach somewhere it shouldn't be able to reach. Somewhere deep below the surface of the earth where no signal should be able to penetrate. It was early March. One of those transitional times when winter is loosening its grip but hasn't quite let go. When you can get beautiful sunny days followed by brutal storms that remind you not to get too comfortable. I was hauling a load of industrial equipment from Detroit to Salt Lake City, taking Interstate 80 through the heartland, a route I'd driven hundreds of times before and knew like the back of my hand. Nothing unusual about the trip. Nothing that would have suggested I was about to experience something that would make me question everything I thought I knew about communication and what might be living beneath our feet. I was somewhere in the middle of Nebraska, that long, flat stretch where the highway cuts straight across the plains for what feels like forever, when my CB radio started acting up. At first it was just normal static, the kind you get when you're between broadcast towers or in an area without much traffic. But then it started to change, to develop a pattern. It wasn't quite Morse code, wasn't anything I recognized, but it definitely had structure, a rhythm and cadence that suggested intelligence rather than random interference. I turned up the volume and listened more carefully, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The static would pulse in groups of 3, then pause, then pulse again in groups of 5, then pause again before starting the pattern over. It went on like that for several minutes while I drove, consistent and regular like a heartbeat or breathing. I checked my CB to make sure it was functioning properly, that I hadn't accidentally changed channels or that some setting hadn't gotten switched. But everything looked normal, tuned to Channel 19 just like always. But this signal, whatever it was coming through loud and clear, getting stronger with each repetition of the pattern. Then, between one pulse and the next, the static cleared and I heard a voice. It was distorted, crackling with interference, and had a strange quality like it was coming from very far away, or being filtered through layers of rock and soil. but it was definitely a human voice, definitely someone speaking English, though I couldn't quite make out the words at first. I grabbed my mic and called out, asking if anyone could hear me if someone needed help. Standard CB protocol for when you pick up what might be a distress signal. The response came back immediately, much clearer now, and what I heard made me nearly drive off the road. "Finally," the voice said, and there was such relief in it, such desperate gratitude that it sent shivers down my spine. "Finally someone can hear me. I've been trying for so long, calling and calling, but nobody ever responds. Please tell me you can hear me. Please tell me I'm not alone down here anymore." I keyed my mic, my hand shaking slightly, and confirmed that yes, I could hear them, that I was receiving their transmission clearly. I asked for their location, their situation, whether they needed emergency services, all the standard questions you ask when someone's in trouble, but the answer I got made no sense at all. Challenged everything I knew about how CB radios work and where signals can reach. "I don't know exactly where I am," the voice said, still crackling with that strange underground quality. "I'm in a tunnel, I think, or maybe a mine, somewhere deep below the surface. I've been walking for days, maybe weeks. I've lost track of time down here in the dark. The walls are stone, natural rock faces, not carved or constructed, and they go on forever in both directions. I can't find a way out, can't find any opening to the surface, can't see any light except for my flashlight, and that's starting to dim. The battery is dying, and when it goes out, I'll be in complete darkness." I asked how they'd gotten down there, what had happened, but the voice seemed confused, uncertain, like the memories were fragmented or unclear. "I was driving," they said. "Driving my truck on a highway somewhere in the Midwest, somewhere flat and empty. It was night, very dark, and there was something on the road ahead of me, something big that I couldn't quite see clearly. I tried to swerve around it, but my truck went off the road, and I remember rolling, tumbling end over end, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I was here, in these tunnels, with no idea how I got here or how long I'd been unconscious." The story didn't make sense, couldn't make sense, because if this person had been in an accident serious enough to knock them unconscious, there would have been debris, wreckage, emergency responders, and how could they have ended up in underground tunnels? Nebraska doesn't have extensive cave systems, and any mines in the area would be shallow and well mapped. Not the kind of endless labyrinth this voice was describing. But the desperation in their tone was real, the fear palpable even through the static and distortion. I told them to stay calm, that I would call for help, get emergency services to triangulate their signal and mount a rescue operation. But when I tried to switch to another channel to make that call, when I tried to reach out to the highway patrol or any other truckers who might be monitoring, my radio wouldn't respond. It was locked on channel 19, locked on this one signal, and no matter what buttons I pushed or settings I adjusted, I couldn't break free of it. The voice came back, now tinged with something that might have been amusement or maybe resignation. "You won't be able to call anyone else," they said. "I've tried. Believe me, I've tried everything. Whatever is down here with me, whatever brought me here and keeps me here, it won't let signals out except for this one, this specific frequency. And only sometimes, only when certain conditions are met. You're the first person who's been able to hear me. The first connection I've made to the surface in all this time. Please don't leave me. Please keep talking. The silence down here, it's worse than the darkness, worse than the hunger or the cold. The silence makes you hear things that aren't there, makes you imagine things in the shadows that might actually be real." So I talked. I drove on through Nebraska while that voice came through my speakers, and I talked about anything and everything I could think of. I described what I was seeing outside my windows, the landscape and the sky, the other vehicles on the road, the small towns I passed with their lights and signs of life. I talked about my family, my history, my experiences on the road over the decades, and the voice talked back, telling me about their own life, their own experiences, though the details seemed strangely vague and inconsistent, like they were having trouble remembering or like the memories didn't quite fit together properly. As I drove, I started to notice something strange about my route. The landscape outside my windows didn't seem to be changing the way it should. I'd been driving for over an hour since picking up that signal. Should have passed several towns and exits, but the scenery remained constant, unchanging. Just flat plains and empty highway stretching ahead without variation. I checked my GPS and saw that it showed me in the same location I'd been in when the transmission started. Not moving at all, despite the fact that my speedometer clearly showed I was traveling at 65 miles per hour. The voice must have sensed my confusion because it laughed, a sound without humor, hollow and echoing. "You're starting to understand, aren't you?" it said. "You're starting to realize that something's wrong, that this conversation is costing you more than you thought. That's how it works down here. It feeds on connection, on communication, on the energy that flows between minds when they interact. The more we talk, the more it pulls you toward me, pulls you down into the darkness where I am. Eventually, if we keep talking long enough, you'll be here with me, trapped in these endless tunnels, and then it will let you broadcast. Let you reach out to the next driver who comes along, and the cycle will continue." I grabbed my mic to respond, to ask what it meant, but the voice continued before I could speak. "I'm sorry," it said, and now there was genuine remorse in the tone, genuine regret. "I'm so sorry for doing this to you, but I've been alone for so long. And the thing that lives in these tunnels, it promised me that if I could bring someone else down here, it would let me go, would let me find my way back to the surface. I didn't want to believe it, didn't want to betray another person like this. But the loneliness, the darkness, the constant fear, it breaks you down eventually, makes you willing to do things you never thought you'd do." I tried to turn off my CB radio, reached for the power switch, but my hand wouldn't move, frozen in place like it was no longer under my control. The voice continued, speaking faster now, words tumbling over each other in a rush. "The tunnels go everywhere, beneath every highway and every road, a network of passages that connects all the dark and lonely places in the world. Things live down here, things that were here long before humans, things that feed on our fear and our isolation. They can't come to the surface, can't exist in the light and the open air, but they can reach up through the earth, can touch the minds of people who are alone and vulnerable, can pull them down into the depths where they belong." My truck was slowing down now, even though my foot was still on the accelerator, the engine struggling like it was climbing a steep grade, even though the road ahead was perfectly flat. The light outside my windows was fading, dimming even though according to my clock it was only mid-afternoon and the sun should be high in the sky. And the road itself was changing, the smooth pavement cracking and crumbling, revealing bare earth beneath, earth that was sinking, creating a depression that grew deeper with each second that passed. The voice was different now too, no longer crackling with static but clear and close, like it was coming from inside my cab rather than through the radio speakers. "I can see you," it said. "I can see your truck, see you sitting in the driver's seat trying to fight against what's happening. It won't work. Nobody who hears the signal can resist it. Nobody who connects with someone in the tunnels can avoid being pulled down. In a few more minutes, you'll be here with me, and we can walk together in the darkness, keep each other company while we wait for the next truck to come along, the next driver to pick up our broadcast and start the cycle again." I don't know what made me think of it, what survival instinct or flash of inspiration gave me the idea, but in that moment of desperation, I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed my mic and I started singing. Not talking, not responding to the voice, just singing at the top of my lungs. Every song I could remember, every hymn and folk tune and rock anthem, filling the airwaves with noise and music and human voice that was mine and mine alone, not responding to or connecting with the entity that was trying to pull me down. The voice shrieked, a sound of rage and frustration that made my speakers rattle and my ears ring. "Stop it!" it screamed. "Stop singing and talk to me. Connect with me. That's the only way this works. We have to maintain the connection. Have to keep the conversation going." But I didn't stop, just kept singing louder and louder, song after song without pause or breath. even when my throat started to hurt and my voice grew hoarse. And slowly, gradually, I felt control returning to my body. My hand could move again, reaching for that power switch on the CB radio. The light outside grew brighter. The road beneath my tires solidified, becoming smooth pavement once more. My GPS showed me moving again, making progress down the highway, leaving behind whatever dark spot I'd been trapped in. With one final burst of effort, I switched off the radio, cutting off the voice mid-scream, and the sudden silence in my cab was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. I pulled over at the next rest area I found, and sat there shaking for over an hour, unable to drive, unable to do anything but stare at that silent CB radio and thank God or fate or whatever force had given me the idea to sing instead of talk. When I finally felt steady enough to continue, I left that radio off, didn't turn it back on for the rest of the trip. Didn't want to risk picking up that signal again or hearing that voice calling from beneath the earth. These days, I still keep my CB on, still monitor Channel 19 like I always have, because the benefits outweigh the risks and because I can't let one bad experience change how I operate. But I'm more careful now about what signals I respond to, more skeptical of voices that seem to come from nowhere, more aware that there might be things beneath our highways, beneath our roads, beneath the thin crust of civilization we've built, things that hunger for connection and communication and the presence of other minds to feed their endless isolation. And sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through empty country, I hear that pulsing static again, those groups of 3 and 5, and I turn the volume down and keep on driving, refusing to acknowledge it, refusing to give it the connection it needs to pull another victim down into those underground tunnels where darkness and loneliness wait forever. The bridge that didn't exist on any map from Lonely Larry. You earn a nickname like Lonely Larry not because you choose to be alone, but because solitude chooses you. Because something about your personality or your presence makes connection difficult and isolation inevitable. I've been driving trucks for 37 years, and in all that time I've had maybe 3 people I'd call friends, none of whom I've spoken to in over a decade. It's not that I'm unfriendly or antisocial. I just seem to exist at a slight angle to the rest of humanity, never quite fitting in, never quite making the bonds that other people form so easily. So I drive alone, eat alone, sleep alone, and mostly I've made peace with that. But there was one night, one bridge, that showed me a version of loneliness so profound, so absolute, that it made my own isolation seem trivial by comparison. It was late autumn, that melancholy time of year when the days are getting shorter and the nights longer, when the air has a bite to it that promises winter's arrival. I was hauling a load of furniture from North Carolina to Michigan, taking back roads through the Appalachian region because the interstate was backed up with construction. These mountain roads can be tricky, narrow and winding with steep drop-offs and limited visibility. But I'd driven them enough times that I felt comfortable navigating them even after dark. Around midnight, I found myself on a particularly isolated stretch of highway that followed a river valley deep into the mountains. There were no other vehicles, no houses or buildings, nothing but forest and rock faces and the occasional glimpse of the river far below, its water black and swift under the thin moonlight. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the yellow center line and the guardrails that were the only thing between me and a lethal plunge into the valley. That's when I came around a curve and saw the bridge ahead. It was old, very old, constructed of stone and iron in a style that hadn't been used in at least a century. It was narrow, barely wide enough for my truck, and it stretched across a gorge that I hadn't known was there. Hadn't seen marked on any of my maps or GPS systems. The stone pillars that supported it looked weathered and ancient, covered in moss and lichen, and the iron railings were rusted and bent in places like they'd been damaged and never repaired. There was no sign indicating the bridge's weight limit, no warning about its condition, nothing to suggest whether it was safe for a loaded semi to cross. By all rights, I should have stopped, should have turned around and found another route. But something compelled me forward. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was that self-destructive impulse that lonely people sometimes develop, or maybe it was something else entirely. Some force emanating from the bridge itself that called to people like me, people who existed at the margins of society and human connection. I slowed to a crawl and eased my truck onto the bridge, feeling it shudder slightly under the weight. The surface was rough stone rather than smooth pavement, and my tires made a grinding sound as they rolled across it. As soon as I was fully on the bridge, completely committed to crossing with no room to turn around, the temperature dropped precipitously and my headlights seemed to dim, their beams barely penetrating the thick shadows that clung to everything. Looking to my left, I could see down into the gorge, and what I saw there made my breath catch in my throat. The drop was much deeper than I'd initially thought. Hundreds of feet down to a rocky riverbed where water rushed over stones in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, almost like they were forming words or symbols. But more disturbing than the depth was what I saw along the walls of the gorge. There were structures there, buildings carved directly into the rock face with windows and doors and balconies that jutted out over the void. They looked impossibly old, weathered by centuries or maybe millennia of wind and water, and they were all dark, completely unlit, giving no indication of whether they were inhabited or abandoned. I forced myself to look back at the road ahead, to focus on keeping my truck centered on the narrow bridge. But in my peripheral vision I could still see those carved dwellings, and I started to notice other things about them. Some had lights now, faint flickering glows like candles or oil lamps visible in windows that had been dark just moments before. And there were figures moving on those balconies, shapes that might have been human but seemed somehow wrong in their proportions. Too tall and thin, moving with an unnatural fluidity. The bridge seemed longer than it should have been, longer than it had looked from the approach, and I realized that I'd been driving across it for several minutes without reaching the other side. Time felt strange here, elastic and unreliable, and when I glanced at my dashboard clock, I saw that the numbers were spinning randomly, unable to maintain any consistent display. My radio was nothing but static, punctuated occasionally by what might have been voices or might have been just random noise shaped by my imagination into something meaningful. That's when I saw the other vehicles on the bridge. They appeared suddenly without warning, both ahead of me and behind, ancient cars and trucks from different eras, all traveling in the same direction, at the same slow crawl. There was a Model T Ford, a 1950s pickup truck, a 1970s station wagon, and others I couldn't immediately identify, all in various states of decay and disrepair. Through their windows I could see drivers, solitary figures hunched over steering wheels, staring straight ahead with expressions of resignation and despair. I tried to slow down, to put distance between my truck and the vehicle ahead of me, but my truck wouldn't respond properly. The brake pedal felt spongy and ineffective, and the steering wheel had gone loose in my hands, offering almost no control over my direction. I was being guided, pulled along by some force that had nothing to do with my engine or my will, drawn deeper into whatever this bridge really was and wherever it truly led. One of the vehicles ahead of me, the 1950s pickup, suddenly swerved and crashed through the iron railing, plunging off the bridge and down into the gorge. I watched in horror as it fell, tumbling end over end, expecting to see it hit the bottom and explode in a fireball. But it never landed, just kept falling into darkness that seemed to have no end, getting smaller and smaller until it disappeared completely from sight. The gap it had left in the line of vehicles closed immediately, the cars behind it moving forward to fill the space, maintaining the slow procession across the impossible bridge. I realized then what this place was, what it represented. This was a bridge for the lonely, for the isolated, for people who had somehow become untethered from the normal world and existed in the spaces between connection and community. Everyone on this bridge was alone, had probably been alone for a long time, and the bridge was taking us somewhere, collecting us, gathering all the lonely people who had driven these roads and failed to find their way back to human warmth and companionship. The buildings carved into the gorge walls made sense now, too. Those were dwellings for the lonely dead, for people who had died alone and unmourned, whose bodies had never been found or whose passing had been noted by no one. This gorge, this bridge, this entire place existed in some twilight realm between life and death, between the world of the living and whatever comes after, and it served as a way station for souls who had no one to remember them, no one to grieve for them, no one to anchor them to the world they'd left behind. My truck was now surrounded by these phantom vehicles, hemmed in on all sides, unable to move forward or back or in any direction except the one the bridge demanded. I could feel myself being pulled, my sense of self becoming less distinct, my memories of people and places growing fuzzy and indistinct. If I stayed on this bridge much longer, if I allowed myself to reach wherever it was leading, I would become like these other drivers, a permanent resident of this place, spending eternity in a slow crawl across an endless bridge spanning in bottomless gorge, alone forever in the company of other lonely souls. But unlike these other drivers, unlike these people who had been so alone in life that they'd somehow fallen through the cracks of reality into this liminal space, I had something they didn't. I had my CB radio, and even though it was full of static, even though no normal signal could reach into this place, I grabbed that mic and I started calling out. I called for help, called for anyone who could hear me, called into the void with all the desperate loneliness I'd accumulated over decades of isolation, and I poured that loneliness not into despair but into a desperate reaching out for connection. At first there was nothing, just static and my own voice echoing back to me, bouncing off those carved dwellings and the stone pillars of the bridge. But then faint and far away I heard a response. It was another driver, someone on the normal world's highway picking up my transmission despite the impossibility of the signal reaching from where I was to where they were. They couldn't understand what I was saying, couldn't make out my words through the interference, but they responded anyway, called back that they could hear something, that someone was out there. That connection, that tiny thread of human interaction was enough. It was an anchor, a lifeline, pulling me back toward the world of the living, toward the realm where people still spoke to each other and saw each other and acknowledged each other's existence. My truck shuddered, the engine catching and responding to my controls again, and the phantom vehicles around me began to fade, becoming translucent and then vanishing entirely as I accelerated, pushing forward with renewed determination. The bridge fought me, tried to hold on, and I could feel a presence in it, could sense an intelligence or awareness that was angry at losing its catch. The stone beneath my tires cracked and split. The iron railings bent and twisted like living things trying to block my path, and the carved dwellings in the gorge walls erupted with light and activity, figures emerging to point and gesture and call out in languages I'd never heard. But I kept that mic keyed, kept talking to that distant driver, kept that connection alive even though neither of us knew what we were really saying to each other. And I drove forward through all the obstacles and all the resistance until suddenly I was across. The normal highway appeared beneath my tires with a jolt, solid and real and beautifully mundane. The temperature returned to normal. My headlights brightened, my radio cleared, and the voice on the other end of that CB connection was suddenly perfectly audible, asking if I was okay, if I needed help, concerned because I'd sounded so distressed. I thanked them, told them I was fine, that I'd just had a moment of confusion but was all right now. We talked for a few more minutes. Normal trucker conversation about weather and traffic and road conditions, and when we finally signed off, I felt more connected to another human being than I had in years. I pulled over at the next rest area and got out to examine my truck, half expecting to find damage from crossing that impossible bridge, but everything looked normal. No scratches or dents or unusual wear. When I looked back down the road I'd just traveled, trying to see if the bridge was still visible, there was nothing there, just normal highway following the river valley through the mountains, no gorge and no ancient stone structure spanning it. Since that night, I've driven that route a dozen times, always during the day, always looking for any sign of that bridge. I've studied maps and historical records, asked locals about old structures in the area, but nobody has ever heard of a stone bridge in that location, and no maps show anything matching its description. It's like it exists in a space that's not quite real, that only becomes accessible under certain conditions, to certain people who are so lonely that they're in danger of slipping through the cracks of reality entirely. I'm still lonely Larry, still spend most of my time alone, still don't have many friends or deep connections, but I'm more careful now about that loneliness, more aware that isolation can become dangerous if you let it go too far, that there are places in this world or adjacent to it where the lonely can get lost forever. And I keep my CB radio on always monitor channel 19, not because I want to chat or because I need constant connection, but because I know now that that radio can be a lifeline, that even the smallest thread of human contact can be enough to pull you back from edges you didn't know you were approaching, from bridges that lead nowhere good and offer no return to those who cross them completely. The rest stop clerk who melted when I blinked from outlaw. Owen, they call me outlaw. Owen, not because I'm actually a criminal, but because I've made a career of running loads that other drivers won't touch, hauling freight through routes that most people consider too dangerous or too unpredictable, taking jobs that require a certain flexibility regarding rules and regulations. I've smuggled untaxed cigarettes across state lines, transported goods of questionable legality, driven through quarantine zones and disaster areas when officials said no vehicles were allowed. I've seen things and done things that would probably cost me my commercial license if anyone in authority knew about them. But nothing, and I mean nothing, in my long and colorful career prepared me for what happened at that rest stop in western Texas. The night I met the clerk who wasn't quite what he appeared to be. It was late July, peak summer heat, and I was hauling a refrigerated load of medical supplies from Houston to Phoenix, taking the southern route through the desert because it was faster, even if it was more brutal on the truck and the driver. The air conditioning in my cab was struggling to keep up with the 115-degree heat outside, and I was going through water bottles like they were going out of style, knowing that dehydration in this environment could kill you before you even realized you were in trouble. The highway stretched ahead like a ribbon of melted tar, shimmering with heat mirages that made the road look wet, even though it hadn't rained in this area for months. Around 3 in the morning, when the temperature had finally dropped to merely uncomfortable instead of potentially lethal, I saw signs for a rest area ahead. This was a welcome sight because I needed to use the facilities and stretch my legs. Plus, I wanted to check on my refrigeration unit to make sure it was still maintaining the proper temperature for the medical cargo. I took the exit and followed the access road to a large, well-lit complex that looked brand new, which surprised me because I'd driven this route many times before and didn't remember this rest stop being here. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a couple of RVs and a sedan parked in the far corners, and I pulled my truck into a space near the main building. The facility was impressive, much nicer than most rest stops, with clean, modern architecture, solar panels on the roof, and landscaping that must have cost a fortune to maintain in this desert climate. Through the large windows, I could see bright fluorescent lighting and what looked like a small convenience store section, in addition to the usual restrooms and vending machines. I climbed down from my cab and headed inside, grateful for the blast of cold air that hit me when I opened the door. The interior was just as impressive as the exterior, with polished tile floors, gleaming fixtures, and shelves stocked with snacks and supplies. At the counter sat a clerk, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and glasses, wearing a uniform shirt with a name tag that read Harold. He looked up when I entered and gave me a smile that seemed friendly enough, though there was something slightly off about it, something I couldn't quite identify. Welcome, he said, his voice pleasant but oddly flat, lacking the natural variations in tone that usually characterize human speech. Hot night out there, isn't it? Well, I suppose it's always hot out here in the summer. Can I help you with anything, or are you just here for the facilities? I told him I was just going to use the restroom and maybe grab some water, and he nodded enthusiastically, that strange smile never wavering. Of course. The restrooms are down that hall to your left, and the cold drinks are in the cooler along the back wall. Take your time, no rush at all. I'll be right here if you need anything. I headed to the restroom, and it was just as clean and modern as the rest of the place, which was unusual enough to be slightly suspicious because, in my experience, rest stop restrooms range from barely acceptable to horror shows that violate several health codes. This one was spotless, with fresh flowers in a vase on the counter and expensive-looking soap dispensers and hand dryers. I used the facilities and washed my hands, then headed back out to grab some water before checking on my truck. Harold was still at the counter, still sitting in exactly the same position, still wearing that exact same smile. In fact, as I walked toward the coolers, I realized he hadn't moved at all, hadn't shifted his weight or adjusted his posture, or done any of the small, unconscious movements that humans do constantly. He was completely still, like a mannequin or a statue, and when I looked closer, I saw that he wasn't breathing, wasn't blinking, wasn't doing anything except sitting there with that frozen smile. I grabbed a couple of bottles of water from the cooler and approached the counter cautiously, suddenly very aware that something was wrong here, that this situation was not what it appeared to be. Harold remained motionless until I was about 3 feet away, and then all at once he animated again, moving and speaking as if there had been no pause at all. "Ah, excellent choice," he said, gesturing at the water bottles. "Hydration is so important in this climate. That'll be $4, please." I paid him, watching carefully, and noticed that his movements were slightly wrong, slightly mechanical, like an animatronic figure at a theme park. His hands moved smoothly, but without the small tremors and adjustments that human hands make. His head turned on his neck like it was on a pivot rather than flexible vertebrae. And when he handed me my change, his fingers felt cold and hard, more like plastic than flesh. But the strangest thing was his eyes. They didn't track properly, didn't follow movement the way eyes should. Instead, they seemed to jump from point to point, always slightly behind where they should be looking. I was backing toward the door, water bottles in hand, ready to get back to my truck and leave this place as quickly as possible, when Harold spoke again. "You shouldn't be in such a hurry to leave," he said. And there was a different quality to his voice now, less flat and mechanical, more layered and complex, like multiple voices speaking in unison. "We don't get many visitors at this hour, and I do enjoy the company. Won't you stay and chat for a while? I can tell you about this facility, about the work we do here, about the purpose we serve." Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but curiosity and that outlaw streak that's gotten me into trouble so many times made me pause. "What purpose is that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady and casual. Harold's smile widened, growing larger than should have been possible on a human face, stretching his mouth until it nearly reached his ears. "Why, we serve travelers like yourself," he said. "We provide a place of rest and refreshment along this long and lonely highway. We offer sanctuary from the heat and the darkness. And in exchange, we ask for so little. Just a moment of your time, just a few minutes of conversation, just enough interaction to sustain us." I was edging toward the door now, moving as casually as I could manage despite the fear coursing through me. But Harold stood up from his stool with a movement that was entirely wrong, his body unfolding in segments like an insect rather than rising the way a human would. "You can't leave yet," he said, and his voice had changed completely now, no longer trying to sound human, instead echoing with harmonics that hurt my ears. "The transaction isn't complete. You've accepted our hospitality, used our facilities, purchased our goods. Now you must pay the full price, must provide what we really need, what we were built to collect." I didn't wait to find out what he meant. I turned and ran for the door, but it was heavier than it should have been, resisting my push like something was holding it shut from the other side. Behind me, I could hear Harold approaching, his footsteps making a clicking sound on the tile floor like hard plastic or chitin on stone. I threw my full weight against the door and it finally gave way, sending me stumbling out into the parking lot just as Harold reached the threshold. The moment he crossed from inside to outside, something changed. His body started to shimmer and distort like I was seeing him through water or heat waves, and then, right before my eyes, he began to melt. That's the only word I can use to describe it. He melted, his body losing cohesion and structure, flowing downward like wax from a candle, colors running together and features blurring. But he was still moving, still trying to reach me. This mass of melting flesh and plastic and something else that definitely wasn't organic, leaving a trail of viscous fluid on the pavement as he advanced. I ran to my truck, fumbled with my keys, and climbed into the cab just as that thing that had been Harold reached my location. It slapped against the side of my truck with a wet sound, leaving streaks of that strange fluid on the paint, and through my window I could see what looked like a face trying to form in the mass. Eyes and mouth appearing and disappearing in the flowing substance, still trying to speak, still trying to complete whatever transaction it believed I owed. I started my engine and threw the truck into gear, not bothering with seatbelt or mirrors or any of the normal safety checks, just needing to get away from this place as fast as possible. As I pulled out of the parking lot and back onto the access road, I looked in my mirrors and saw that the entire rest stop was changing, melting just like Harold had. The building sagging and flowing, colors running together, the solar panels drooping like wilted flowers. Within seconds, the whole complex had collapsed into a spreading pool of that strange fluid, and by the time I reached the highway, there was nothing visible in my mirrors except empty desert. I drove for 2 hours straight before I felt safe enough to stop again, and when I finally did pull over at a legitimate rest area, one that I knew for certain had been there for decades, I got out to examine my truck. There were marks on the side where that melted thing had touched it. Not quite burns and not quite stains. More like the metal itself had been partially dissolved or transformed. The paint was discolored in those areas, and when I touched it, it felt slightly warm and had a texture that was somehow wrong, somehow not quite solid. I reported the incident to no one because what would I say? That I'd stopped at a rest stop that shouldn't exist and been attacked by a clerk who melted in the open air? Nobody would believe me. And even if they did, what could they do about it? These things, whatever they are, seem to exist in the gaps and margins, in places that aren't quite part of the normal world. And they prey on travelers who are too tired or too desperate to notice the warning signs, too focused on their own needs to realize they're walking into a trap. Since that night, I'm much more careful about where I stop, more aware of facilities that seem too new or too perfect, more suspicious of clerks in attendance who don't quite move right or don't quite sound human, and I've learned to trust my instincts. Learned that when something feels off, even if I can't articulate exactly what's wrong, it's better to keep driving, better to push through discomfort or exhaustion than to stop at a place that might be more than it appears, that might be hungry for something more than money, that might exact a price that can't be paid in any currency recognized by the normal world. The radio station. That broadcast, my own voice from Iron Ike. They call me Iron Ike because I've got a reputation for being unshakable, for staying calm and composed no matter what happens on the road, for handling every crisis and emergency with the kind of steady nerves that comes from decades of experience and a naturally stoic temperament. I've driven through tornadoes and earthquakes, I've navigated mountain passes in whiteout conditions, I've dealt with mechanical failures and cargo disasters without breaking a sweat. But there was one night, one radio station, that shook me to my core and made me question not just my perceptions but my very identity, and whether the person I think I am is really the person I've always been. It was mid-September, one of those perfect autumn nights when the air is crisp and clear and the sky is full of stars, when driving feels less like work and more like meditation, a peaceful communion with the road and the night. I was hauling a load of electronics from Seattle to Atlanta, taking the northern route through Montana and North Dakota, before cutting south through the plains. Traffic was light, weather was perfect, and I was making excellent time, feeling that rare combination of alertness and relaxation that makes long-haul driving actually enjoyable, rather than just a job. Around 2 in the morning, somewhere in the middle of South Dakota, I was scanning through radio stations trying to find something to listen to. Most of the channels were either static or playing commercials. But then I hit on a station that came in crystal clear, no interference or fade, just perfect reception in an area where radio signals usually struggle. What caught my attention immediately was the voice on the air, because it sounded exactly like mine. Same tone and cadence and accent, same speech patterns and verbal tics, like listening to a recording of myself speaking. At first I thought it was just coincidence, that this DJ happened to have a voice similar to mine, but as I listened more carefully, the similarity became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the voice that was the same. It was the specific phrases and expressions I use, the way I structure sentences, even the little pauses and hesitations that are unique to my speaking style. This person on the radio sounded more like me than I sound like myself, if that makes any sense. Like they'd studied my speech patterns in exhaustive detail and were reproducing them perfectly. The station was playing music, classic rock and country, interspersed with the DJ's commentary, and I found myself getting increasingly unsettled as I listened. The DJ was talking about trucking, about life on the road, telling stories that seemed familiar even though I couldn't quite place where I'd heard them before. He talked about driving through a blizzard in Wyoming, about a close call with a drunk driver in Louisiana, about mechanical problems in the middle of the Nevada desert, and with each story I felt a growing sense of recognition, a feeling that these weren't just similar to my experiences but were my experiences, my memories. My life being broadcast over the airwaves by someone or something that somehow had access to them. Then the DJ said something that made my blood run cold. "This next song goes out to Iron Ike," he said in my voice, "who's driving south on Highway 83 right now, somewhere between Vivian and Presho, hauling electronics to Atlanta and wondering what the hell he's listening to. Hey Ike, I know you're confused, I know this is unsettling, but keep listening. We need to talk, you and I. We need to discuss some things about who you are and who you think you are and whether those two things are actually the same." I nearly drove off the road, my hands jerking the wheel involuntarily before I regained control. How did this DJ know my name, know my route, know exactly where I was at this precise moment? I grabbed my CB radio mic, thinking maybe this was some kind of prank by another trucker. Someone who'd been following me and was messing with me over the radio. But the CB was silent, no traffic at all on any channel. I checked my phone thinking maybe I'd been hacked. Maybe someone had access to my GPS and my personal information. But the phone showed no unusual activity, no apps running that shouldn't be. The music started, a song I'd always liked but hadn't heard in years, and the DJ's voice, my voice, came back on as it faded out. "I bet you're checking your electronics right now, trying to figure out how this is happening, trying to find a rational explanation. That's very like you, Ike, very predictable. You've always been the practical one, the logical one, the one who refuses to believe in anything that can't be explained by science and reason. But what if I told you that you're not who you think you are? What if I told you that the man you remember being, the life you remember living, isn't actually real?" I reached for the radio dial, intending to change stations or turn it off entirely, but my hand froze before I could touch it. Not because something was preventing me physically, but because I desperately needed to hear what came next, needed to understand what this voice, this impossible broadcast, was trying to tell me. The DJ continued, speaking in my voice with that unsettling familiarity. "You remember being born in Wisconsin, growing up on a dairy farm, learning to drive in your father's old pickup truck. You remember high school, remember your first girlfriend, remember deciding to become a trucker because you loved the freedom and the independence. You remember 32 years on the road. Remember all the places you've been and the things you've seen. But Ike, what if those memories aren't yours? What if they were implanted, programmed, designed to make you believe you're a real person with a real history when you're actually something else entirely. The landscape outside my windows seemed to blur and shift, and for a moment I felt dizzy, disoriented, like the ground was falling away beneath me even though my truck was steady on the pavement. The DJ kept talking, relentless and insistent. Think about it carefully, Ike. When was the last time you saw your family? When was the last time you visited your hometown? When was the last time you had a meaningful interaction with anyone from your past? Anyone who knew you before you became a trucker? You can't remember, can you? Because those interactions never happened. Those people don't exist. That life you remember is nothing but a constructed narrative designed to give you context and purpose. I tried to think back, tried to remember specific details about my childhood and my family, and was horrified to discover that everything was vague and general, like scenes from a movie rather than actual lived experiences. I could remember the dairy farm in broad strokes, but not specific rooms or objects. I could remember my parents, but not their exact faces or the sound of their voices. I could remember events and milestones, but not the details that should surround such memories. Not the sensory information and emotional texture that makes real memories distinct from imagination. You're starting to understand now, aren't you? The DJ said, and there was something almost sympathetic in his tone, in my tone. You're realizing that what you thought was your life might be nothing but a carefully constructed illusion. And here's the really difficult part, Ike. I'm not some external entity trying to deceive you. I'm not a hacker or a stalker or a government agent. I'm you. Or rather, I'm the part of you that's aware of what you really are. The part that exists outside the constructed narrative. I'm trying to wake you up, trying to break through the programming and help you see the truth. The radio station started playing another song, but underneath it I could hear other sounds. Strange electronic tones and pulses that seemed to interact with my brain in uncomfortable ways, making my vision swim and my thoughts fragment. The DJ's voice wove through the music and the tones. You're not a human being, Ike. You're a simulation, a construct, a sophisticated program running in a substrate you can't perceive or understand. Everything you think of as reality, the road and the truck and the cargo and all these places you drive through, it's all part of the simulation, all designed to keep you occupied and unaware of your true nature. And this radio station, this broadcast you're hearing, it's a glitch in the programming, a moment when the barriers between levels of reality become thin enough that truth can leak through. I was gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white, my breath coming in short gasps as panic threatened to overwhelm my iron composure. This couldn't be real, couldn't be true. It had to be some kind of psychological attack or manipulation or elaborate prank. But the more I thought about it, the more I examined my memories and my sense of self. The more I found gaps and inconsistencies, places where things didn't quite add up, moments that felt more scripted than spontaneous. I know this is difficult to accept, the DJ continued. I know it challenges everything you believe about yourself and your existence. But consider this, Ike. Have you ever wondered why you never get seriously injured or sick? Why your truck always manages to avoid catastrophic accidents even in the most dangerous conditions? Why you've been driving for 32 years without any major health problems or life-disrupting events? It's because you're protected by the parameters of the simulation. Because the program needs you to continue functioning, needs you to keep driving these routes and completing these deliveries as part of some larger process that you're not meant to understand. A memory surfaced, something I'd never thought about before. I had been in what should have been a deadly accident 5 years ago. A multi-vehicle pileup in fog where cars and trucks were crashing into each other at highway speeds. My truck had been right in the middle of it, should have been crushed or rolled over, but somehow I'd emerged without a scratch, without even any damage to my vehicle. At the time, I'd chalked it up to incredible luck and good reflexes. But now, looking back with this new horrifying perspective, it seemed impossible, statistically beyond the bounds of probability. You're remembering now, the DJ said. You're starting to see the pattern, starting to notice all the times when things worked out too perfectly, when disasters were averted by margins too narrow to be believable. when the simulation protected you, because it needed you to continue. And here's what you need to understand, Ike. I'm not telling you this to torment you or drive you mad. I'm telling you because there's a choice coming. A moment when you'll have the opportunity to exit the simulation, to stop being Iron Ike the trucker and become something else, something real, something that exists outside these programmed boundaries. The highway ahead seemed to shimmer and distort, and for just a moment I saw something else overlaid on top of it. A vast network of glowing lines and nodes, a mathematical framework underlying what I'd always thought of as physical reality. Then it was gone, leaving me staring at normal pavement and white lines, but the image had been so vivid, so detailed, that I couldn't convince myself it had been a hallucination. The DJ's voice, my voice, continued its relentless assault on my sense of reality. The exit point is coming up in 5 miles. You'll see a rest area that you've never noticed before despite driving this route dozens of times. If you pull in there, if you walk to the building and enter the door marked Maintenance, you'll find a terminal, an interface point between the simulation and what lies beyond it. Use that terminal and you can log out, can stop being this character and return to whatever you really are in the base reality. But I have to warn you, Ike, if you make that choice, if you exit the simulation, everything you think of as your life will cease to exist. Iron Ike will be gone, and you'll be something or someone else entirely, possibly something you won't recognize or understand. I saw the rest area sign ahead, exactly where the DJ had said it would be, marking a facility I'd never seen before on a route I'd driven countless times. My foot moved toward the brake, preparing to slow down and take the exit, preparing to see if this impossible story had any truth to it. But then another thought occurred to me, a question that the DJ, that the voice claiming to be the real me, hadn't addressed. What if this was the deception? What if the simulation wasn't my life as a trucker, but was instead this moment, this experience, this radio broadcast, designed to make me doubt my reality and drive me mad, or make me do something destructive? The DJ seemed to hear my thoughts, seemed to sense my hesitation. You're wondering if this is the trap, if I'm the liar and your normal life is the truth. That's a fair question, Ike, and I can't prove anything to you one way or the other. You have to make a choice based on your intuition, based on what feels more real, the life you've been living or the possibility I'm presenting. But consider this. If you ignore this exit, if you keep driving and try to forget this conversation, you'll never know for certain. You'll spend the rest of your existence wondering if you're real or simulated, questioning every experience and every memory, never able to fully trust your perceptions again. Is that really better than taking the chance, than finding out the truth even if it's uncomfortable or incomprehensible? The exit was right ahead now, the off-ramp clearly visible and easy to access. My truck was slowing automatically, my subconscious making the decision even as my conscious mind wrestled with the implications. But then I saw something that changed everything. In my side mirror, I caught a glimpse of another truck behind me, far back but clearly visible, and the driver looked exactly like me. Same face and same build and same trucking company logo on the vehicle. And behind that truck was another and another, all with drivers who looked identical to me, all following the same route, all presumably hearing the same radio broadcast. The DJ's voice had gone silent. The music had stopped, and the radio was now producing only that strange electronic tone, pulsing with a rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat. The rest area was passing by my window now, the moment of choice slipping away as my truck continued down the highway. I had kept driving, had made the decision, consciously or unconsciously, to stay in this reality, to remain Iron Ike even if that identity was nothing but a construct, even if my entire existence was simulated rather than real. The radio suddenly switched to a normal station, playing normal music, as if that impossible broadcast had never happened. The landscape returned to looking solid and real, no more shimmering or distortion, no more glimpses of underlying frameworks. And when I checked my side mirrors, there was only darkness behind me. No procession of identical trucks, no duplicate versions of myself. Everything was normal again, or at least appeared to be. But I haven't been the same since that night. Haven't been able to recapture that iron composure that gave me my nickname. I drive the same routes, haul the same loads, go through all the same motions, but now there's always a part of me that's watching and questioning, wondering if any of this is real, wondering what I might have found if I'd taken that exit, wondering if the trucks I see around me on the highway contain other versions of myself, all living their own variation of the same programmed existence. And sometimes, late at night when I'm scanning through radio stations, I hear fragments of that voice, my voice, calling from somewhere beyond the boundaries of what I think of as reality, still trying to wake me up, still offering an exit that I'm too afraid to take, because the truth, whatever it might be, could be far more terrifying than the comfortable illusion I've chosen to accept as my life. The girl who knocked from inside my cargo from Diesel, Dave, I've been hauling freight for 28 years. And in that time, I've transported just about everything you can imagine. From livestock to luxury cars. From industrial chemicals to fine art. From mundane consumer goods to military equipment that I wasn't supposed to ask questions about. I've always taken pride in being professional and responsible, in treating every load like it matters regardless of what's inside, and making sure that whatever I pick up gets delivered safely and on time. But there was one load, one absolutely routine delivery that should have been simple and straightforward, that turned into a nightmare I still can't fully explain. A horror that started with knocking sounds from inside a sealed trailer that shouldn't have contained anything capable of making noise. It was early November, cold and gray with the kind of damp chill that seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you wear, and I was picking up a load from a warehouse in Pennsylvania, heading to a distribution center in Tennessee. The paperwork said it was furniture, office chairs and desks and filing cabinets all boxed and crated and strapped down securely. I did my standard inspection, checked that the load was properly secured, that the weight was distributed correctly, that the doors were sealed properly with the security tag intact. All the things you're supposed to do before accepting a load and hitting the road. The first few hours of the drive were completely normal. Uneventful highway miles through Pennsylvania and into West Virginia, with the only notable feature being the increasingly bad weather as a storm system moved through the region. Rain was coming down hard by the time I crossed into West Virginia, and visibility was poor enough that I had to slow down and be extra cautious, especially on the mountainous sections where the road twisted and curved through terrain that was dangerous even in good conditions. I was about 5 hours into the trip, somewhere in the mountains with darkness falling and rain still pounding, when I heard it for the first time, a knocking sound, 3 slow, deliberate knocks coming from inside my trailer. I dismissed it initially as cargo shifting, maybe something not secured as well as it should have been, settling and moving around as I navigated the curves and grades. But then it came again, 3 knocks, same rhythm, same spacing, and there was something about the pattern that seemed intentional rather than random, seemed like someone was knocking rather than something was shifting. I pulled over at the next wide spot in the road and got out to check the trailer, rain soaking through my jacket within seconds. The security seal was intact, showing no signs of tampering, and when I pressed my ear against the trailer wall, I couldn't hear anything from inside except maybe a faint rustling sound that could have been wind or could have been something else. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the sound was probably just the load settling or maybe some kind of acoustic effect from the rain and wind, but I felt uneasy getting back in the cab and continuing down the road. The knocking came again about 20 minutes later. 3 knocks followed by a pause and then 3 more. A clear pattern that couldn't be dismissed as random cargo movement. And this time there was something else. A sound underneath the knocking that might have been a voice, might have been someone calling out. Though I couldn't make out any words through the layers of metal and cargo, I grabbed my CB radio and called out to any other truckers in the area, asking if they'd ever experienced anything like this. If there was any normal explanation for what I was hearing. A driver called back, voice crackling with static from the storm. "You sure that load was sealed when you picked it up?" he asked. "Nobody could have gotten inside before you took possession?" I confirmed that yes, the seal had been intact, that I'd personally checked it, that there was no way anyone could be inside the trailer without my knowledge. The other driver was quiet for a moment before responding. "Then you need to stop and check again, buddy. Break that seal if you have to. Make sure there's nothing alive in there, because if someone did get sealed inside, they won't last long without air, and they sure as hell won't last long in this cold." The thought that someone might actually be trapped in my trailer, suffocating or freezing while I drove along oblivious to their distress, was horrifying enough to override my concerns about breaking the security seal without authorization. I pulled over again, this time at a closed rest area where I had room to open the trailer doors, and I walked back with my flashlight, rain still pouring down, hands shaking as I reached for the seal. But when I examined it closely, I noticed something I'd missed before. The seal was intact, yes, but the serial number didn't match the one on my paperwork. Someone had replaced it, had opened my trailer at some point without my knowledge and sealed it again with a different tag. I broke the seal and swung open the trailer doors, shining my flashlight inside, half expecting to see someone huddled among the crates, desperate and terrified. But there was nothing, just the furniture cargo exactly as it should be, neatly stacked and secured, showing no signs of disturbance or any space where a person could hide. I climbed up into the trailer and walked through it, checking behind and between the crates, looking for any indication that someone was or had been inside, but found nothing except properly loaded freight. I was just about to give up and close the doors when I heard it again, the knocking, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. But this time I could pinpoint the location. It was coming from inside one of the large crates, a wooden box about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide and 3 feet tall, labeled as containing a conference table. I approached the crate carefully, flashlight beam fixed on it, and pressed my ear against the wood. I could hear something inside, not just knocking now, but movement and breathing, definitely breathing. The sound of someone drawing air in and out of their lungs. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone in there? Can you hear me?" The knocking stopped immediately, replaced by a scrabbling sound like fingernails on wood, and then a voice, small and frightened and definitely belonging to a child, maybe a girl around 8 or 10 years old. "Please help me," she said, words muffled by the wood but perfectly understandable. "Please get me out of here. It's dark and cold and I can't breathe very well and I'm scared." My heart was hammering as I looked around for something to pry open the crate. I found a crowbar in my truck's toolkit and came back, working the claw under the lid and levering it up, nails screaming as they pulled free from the wood. The lid came off and I shined my flashlight inside, expecting to see a frightened child curled up among the packing materials. But the crate was empty, completely empty, containing nothing but air and the faint smell of sawdust and fresh wood. No child, no person, nothing that could have been making those sounds or speaking those words. "Where are you?" I shouted, confusion and fear making my voice harsh. "I opened the crate. Where did you go?" The voice came back, still sounding like it was coming from inside the crate even though the crate was clearly empty. "I'm still here," the girl said. "I'm still trapped. Why can't you see me? Why won't you help me?" I thrust my arm into the crate, waving it around, trying to find something my flashlight couldn't see, but there was nothing. Just empty space that shouldn't be able to contain a voice. Then the voice changed, lost its childlike quality and became something else. Something older and colder and full of malice. "You should have kept driving, Dave," it said, using my name even though I hadn't told it what I was called. "You should have minded your own business and just delivered the load like you were supposed to. But you had to stop. Had to investigate, had to open the box. And now that you've opened it, now that you've broken the seal, I can get out." Something moved in the darkness at the back of my trailer beyond the range of my flashlight. Something large and dark that definitely hadn't been there when I first opened the doors. I heard footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming toward me from deeper in the trailer, and I saw a shape emerging from the shadows, tall and thin and moving with a strange, jerky motion, like a puppet on strings. The voice came again, no longer from the empty crate, but from this approaching figure. "The furniture company didn't pack me," it said. "They don't even know I'm here. I've been riding in trucks for a long time, Dave. Decades probably, though I've lost track of the years. I get sealed into trailers, hidden away in crates and cargo, and I ride from place to place. And sometimes when the conditions are right, when a driver is alone and vulnerable and the night is dark enough, I knock. I knock and I wait to see if they'll stop, if they'll investigate, if they'll open the doors and break the seal. And when they do, when they let me out, well, then I have a chance to do what I do to feed on what I need." I was backing toward the trailer doors, flashlight beam fixed on that approaching shape, and as it came into the light I saw what it really was and wish I hadn't. It had been human once, maybe, but something had gone terribly wrong with it, had twisted and changed it into something that only vaguely resembled a person. It was impossibly tall, 8 or 9 feet, and impossibly thin, like it had been stretched on a rack, and its face was wrong, features too large and misplaced. Mouth full of teeth that were too numerous and too sharp, eyes that reflected my flashlight like an animal's, but with an intelligence and hunger that was disturbingly human. I jumped down from the trailer and ran for my cab, that thing pursuing me with surprising speed despite its ungainly appearance. I could hear it behind me, could hear its breathing, a wet rasping sound like lungs full of fluid. Could hear its footsteps splashing in the puddles, getting closer with each second. I reached my cab and yanked open the door, practically throwing myself inside, and slammed it shut just as the thing reached me, its hand, if you could call it a hand, slapping against the window hard enough to crack the glass. I started the engine with shaking hands, threw the truck into gear, and pulled away from that rest area with the trailer door still open, not caring about the cargo or the regulations or anything except getting away from that nightmare. In my mirrors, I could see the thing standing in the parking lot, rain pouring down on its distorted form, watching me drive away with those terrible glowing eyes. And as I watched, it turned and walked back toward the woods at the edge of the rest area, disappearing into the darkness like it had never been there at all. I drove straight through to Tennessee without stopping. Didn't sleep, didn't eat, didn't do anything except keep moving and try to process what had happened. When I finally reached the distribution center, when workers opened my trailer to unload the cargo, they found everything intact and properly secured, including the crate I'd opened, which was somehow closed again with a new lid nailed in place as if I'd never pried it open. They found no evidence of any disturbance, no indication that anything unusual had happened during transport, and when I tried to explain what I'd experienced, what I'd seen and heard, they looked at me with concern and suggested I might need some rest, might be experiencing the effects of too many hours on the road and not enough sleep. Maybe they were right. Maybe the whole thing was a hallucination or a dream or a mental break brought on by exhaustion and stress. But I don't think so, because sometimes late at night when I'm hauling a load and the roads are empty and dark, I hear it again, that knocking, 3 slow, deliberate knocks coming from inside my trailer. And I don't stop anymore, don't investigate, don't break any seals or open any doors. I just keep driving, keep the music loud and try not to listen. Try not to think about what might be riding in my trailer, what might be knocking from inside the cargo, what might be waiting for the next driver foolish enough or compassionate enough to stop and open the doors and let it out into the world. The highway patrol car that followed me through the fog from Ghost Gear Gary, they call me. Ghost Gear Gary because I've got a knack for slipping past way stations and inspections without getting caught, for operating in the gray areas of regulations without quite crossing the line into illegal activity, for being present without being noticed. I've been driving for 40 years, and in that time I've developed an almost supernatural awareness of law enforcement presence, an instinct that tells me when to slow down, when to change lanes, when to take a different route to avoid unwanted attention. But there was one night, one stretch of highway in Oregon, when that instinct failed me completely, when I found myself being followed by a patrol car that shouldn't have been there, and couldn't have been what it appeared to be. It was late February, one of those wet, miserable nights when fog rolls in from the Pacific and blankets everything in a thick gray curtain that reduces visibility to almost nothing. I was hauling a load of timber from the forests of southern Oregon down to the mills near the California border, taking Highway 101 along the coast because the inland route was closed due to mudslides. The highway was treacherous in these conditions, winding through hills and valleys with steep drop-offs to the ocean on one side and rock faces on the other, with the fog so thick that my headlights barely penetrated 10 feet ahead. Traffic was almost non-existent, as you'd expect at 3 in the morning in these conditions, and I'd been driving for almost 2 hours without seeing another vehicle. The isolation was complete. Just me and my truck and the fog and the occasional glimpse of ocean waves crashing against rocks far below. It was peaceful in a way, meditative, the kind of driving where your mind can wander while your body handles the mechanics almost automatically. But that peace was shattered when I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw lights behind me, red and blue lights flashing through the fog, the unmistakable signature of a highway patrol vehicle signaling me to pull over. My first reaction was confusion because I knew I hadn't been speeding, hadn't been doing anything wrong, hadn't given any reason for law enforcement to stop me. My second reaction was concern because pulling over on this narrow road in these conditions would be dangerous. With barely enough shoulder to accommodate my truck and no visibility for other vehicles that might come along. But you don't ignore a patrol car signal, so I slowed down and carefully eased my truck onto what little shoulder space was available, hoping this would be quick and routine. I watched in my mirror as the patrol car pulled in behind me, its light still flashing but somehow looking strange in the fog, the colors seeming wrong, the pattern of flashes not quite matching what I was used to seeing. The car sat there for several minutes, engine running, lights flashing, but nobody got out. No officer approached my window. Nothing happened. I waited, hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen, following proper protocol. But as the minutes stretched on with no activity, I started to feel uneasy. After maybe 5 minutes of this strange standoff, I saw the patrol car's door open and a figure emerge. Through the fog and the darkness, I could make out what looked like a standard highway patrol uniform. But something about the way the figure moved was off, too stiff and mechanical, like someone unaccustomed to walking or like the joints didn't quite bend right. The figure approached my truck slowly and I rolled down my window, preparing to hand over my license and registration, but when the figure got close enough that I could see details, my breath caught in my throat. The face under that patrol officer's hat wasn't right, wasn't quite human, though at first glance it might have passed for one. The features were too symmetrical, too perfect, like a computer-generated image of what a human face should look like rather than an actual human face with all its natural imperfections and asymmetries. The eyes didn't blink, didn't move naturally, just stared with an unnerving intensity, and the skin had a waxy quality, almost translucent, with no visible pores or blemishes or any of the small details that make skin look alive. License and registration, it said. And the voice was wrong too, flat and emotionless and somehow coming from the wrong place, like it was being projected from somewhere behind the figure, rather than actually coming from its mouth. I fumbled for my documents, hands shaking, and passed them through the window. The figure took them with hands that moved too smoothly, fingers that bent in ways fingers shouldn't bend, and examined them with those strange, unblinking eyes. "Do you know why I stopped you?" it asked. Still in that flat, emotionless voice. I said no, that I didn't think I'd been breaking any traffic laws, that I'd been driving carefully given the conditions. The figure tilted its head at an angle that would have broken a normal person's neck, considering my response. "You were exceeding the posted speed limit by 7 miles per hour, it said. "You failed to signal when changing lanes 3 miles back. Your right rear tire pressure is 4 pounds below the recommended level." The accusations were absurd, easily disproven. I knew for certain I hadn't been speeding because I'd been watching my speedometer carefully in these conditions. I hadn't changed lanes because there was only one lane in each direction and nowhere to change to. And even if my tire pressure was slightly low, there's no way a patrol officer could have detected that just by following me. But I didn't argue, didn't point out these impossibilities, because every instinct was screaming at me that this wasn't really a police stop, that this thing wearing a uniform wasn't really a highway patrol officer, that I was in danger more serious than any traffic citation. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," the figure said. "I need to conduct a safety inspection of your truck and cargo." That's when I knew for certain something was very wrong, because highway patrol officers don't conduct DOT inspections on the side of the road at 3 in the morning in heavy fog. And they especially don't do it alone without backup or proper facilities. This thing, whatever it was, wanted me out of my truck, wanted me vulnerable and exposed, and I had no intention of complying. "I'd prefer to wait until we can do this at a proper inspection station," I said, trying to keep my voice steady and professional, for safety reasons with the fog and the narrow shoulder and the traffic conditions. The figure's head tilted the other way, that impossible angle again, and its expression, if you could call it an expression, changed slightly, the mouth stretching into something that might have been meant to be a smile, but looked more like a predator baring its teeth. "Step out of the vehicle now," it said, and the voice had changed too, had lost even the pretense of being human, had become layered and strange, like multiple voices speaking slightly out of sync. "This is not a request. This is a lawful order. Refusal to comply will result in arrest and impoundment of your vehicle." The figure reached for where a police officer would normally carry a weapon, and I saw that the holster was empty, or rather, it contained something that wasn't a gun, something organic and moving, something that writhed and pulsed with its own life. I made a snap decision born of 40 years of instinct and experience. I threw my truck into gear and accelerated, pulling back onto the highway with my tires spinning on the wet pavement, not caring about procedure or regulations or anything except getting away from that thing and whatever it wanted to do to me. Through my mirrors, I saw the figure stand there watching me go, not pursuing, not showing any reaction at all, just standing motionless in the fog as I put distance between us. But I'd only gone maybe a quarter mile when I saw the lights again in my mirrors, those red and blue flashes coming through the fog, the patrol car somehow catching up. Even though I was pushing my truck as fast as I dared in these conditions, it pulled up close behind me, so close I could see details of the vehicle now that I couldn't see before, and those details were wrong. The patrol car was old, looked like a model from the 1960s or 70s, but it was in perfect condition, no rust or wear or any signs of age. And painted on the side where department insignia should be were symbols I didn't recognize, geometric patterns that hurt to look at, that seemed to shift and change when I tried to focus on them. The car started to pull alongside me, moving into the oncoming lane even though we were on a narrow 2-lane road with blind curves and visibility of maybe 20 feet. I could see the driver now, or what passed for a driver, and it was the same kind of figure that had approached my window, same perfect features, same waxy skin, same terrible unblinking eyes. It was gesturing at me, pointing toward the shoulder, indicating that I should pull over again. But there was something threatening in the gesture, something that made it clear this was no longer a request or even an order, but a warning that something bad would happen if I didn't comply. I kept driving, refused to pull over, and the patrol car matched my speed, staying alongside me, sometimes pulling slightly ahead and then dropping back, like it was toying with me, demonstrating that it could overtake me whenever it wanted but choosing not to. Through the passenger window of the patrol car, I could see into the back seat, and what I saw there made me understand why this thing wanted me to stop, what it had planned for me if I'd gotten out of my truck. The back seat was full of people, or what had been people, Multiple bodies crammed into a space that shouldn't have been able to hold more than 2 or 3, all twisted and contorted and showing signs of having been there for a very long time. Their faces were pressed against the window, mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide with terror and pain, and they were all wearing civilian clothes. Truckers and travelers who had probably been stopped on this same stretch of highway, who had probably complied with orders to exit their vehicles, who were now trapped in the back of this impossible patrol car for reasons and purposes I couldn't begin to imagine. The patrol car suddenly swerved toward me, trying to push me off the road, and I had to wrench my steering wheel hard to avoid being forced over the edge and down into the ocean far below. My truck tilted dangerously, tires on the left side lifting off the pavement for a heart-stopping moment before settling back down. The patrol car pulled back, gave me some space, then accelerated and moved ahead, its brake lights glowing red through the fog as it slowed and stopped, blocking the road completely, leaving me no choice but to stop or crash into it. I slammed on my brakes, my truck shuddering and fishtailing on the wet pavement, coming to a stop about 10 feet from the patrol car's rear bumper. The driver's door opened and that figure emerged again, started walking toward my truck with that same mechanical stride. I threw my truck into reverse, but before I could back up, I heard a sound that saved my life. The sound of another vehicle approaching from behind, real headlights cutting through the fog, a real truck with a real driver coming up the highway behind me. The figure stopped, turned to look at the approaching vehicle, and for the first time showed something like emotion, something like frustration or anger. It hurried back to the patrol car, got in, and the vehicle suddenly accelerated, tires smoking, and disappeared into the fog ahead so quickly that it was almost like it had simply vanished. The truck behind me pulled up alongside, and the driver rolled down his window asking if I was okay, if I needed help. I told him I was fine, that I'd stopped because I thought I saw something in the road, and after a brief conversation, we both continued on our way. But I stayed close behind him for the rest of the drive down to California, grateful for the presence of another human being, another real person, something to remind me that I was still in the normal world and not trapped in whatever nightmare dimension that patrol car had come from. I've never driven that stretch of Highway 101 at night again. Always make sure to time my run so I'm passing through during daylight hours, and when I see patrol cars behind me now, when those red and blue lights start flashing in my mirrors, I always look carefully before pulling over. Make sure the vehicle looks right. Make sure the proportions match standard patrol cars. Make sure there aren't any impossible details or wrong symbols or shapes in the backseat that shouldn't be there. Because I know now that not everything that looks like law enforcement is really law enforcement. That there are things out there that wear the uniforms and drive the vehicles and follow the procedures, but do it all in the service of something terrible, something that hunts along our highways and preys on travelers who are alone and vulnerable and too willing to trust that authority. And official appearances mean safety rather than danger. The gas station. That kept moving locations from Mudflat Marty, they call me. Mudflat Marty because I've driven through more mud and muck than most drivers see in a lifetime. Hauling loads through construction zones and logging roads in places where pavement is more of a suggestion than a reality. I've got a reputation for being able to navigate just about any terrain, for never getting stuck, for always finding a way through no matter how bad the conditions. But there's one place I couldn't navigate, one location that defied all logic and geography, a gas station that appeared when I needed it most and then refused to let me leave, moving and shifting through space in ways that should have been impossible. It was late April, one of those unseasonably hot spring days when summer arrives early and catches everyone off guard, and I was hauling a load of agricultural equipment from Iowa to Nevada, taking the scenic route through the back roads of Nebraska and Wyoming, because the interstates were jammed with holiday weekend traffic. I'd miscalculated my fuel stops, a rookie mistake that I should have known better than to make, and I found myself running dangerously low on diesel in the middle of nowhere, with my gauge showing less than an eighth of a tank, and my GPS indicating that the nearest station was still 40 miles ahead. The landscape around me was classic high plains, flat and empty and stretching to the horizon in every direction, with nothing but sagebrush and occasional fence lines to break the monotony. The heat was oppressive, waves of it rising from the pavement and creating mirages that made the road ahead shimmer and waver like liquid. I was sweating despite my air conditioning, anxious about the fuel situation, calculating and recalculating whether I could make it to the next station, or if I'd end up stranded on the side of the road in this heat waiting for a fuel delivery truck. That's when I saw it. Rising out of the heat shimmer like a gift from heaven, a gas station appearing on the horizon where my GPS showed nothing but empty land. At first I thought it was a mirage, just another trick of the light and heat, but as I got closer it remained solid and real, resolving into a small independent station of the kind that used to be common, but are increasingly rare these days, with just 2 pumps and a small building that served as both office and convenience store. The sign read Last Chance Fuel in faded letters, and underneath it, open 24 hours. I pulled in gratefully, my fuel gauge now showing that I was running on fumes, and positioned my truck at the diesel pump. The station looked old, probably dating back to the 1950s or 60s, with vintage pumps that had been retrofitted with modern payment systems, but still retained their classic appearance. The building was constructed of weathered wood and stone, with a covered porch that provided shade from the brutal sun, and through the windows I could see shelves stocked with snacks and supplies. As I was filling my tank, a man emerged from the building, middle-aged with graying hair and wearing coveralls that had seen better days. He had a friendly smile and a casual manner, the kind of person who seems completely at ease with themselves and their place in the world. "Hot day for traveling," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "You came along just in time. Looks like you were about to run dry there. Lucky you found us when you did." I agreed that it was indeed lucky, mentioned that I hadn't seen this station marked on my GPS, and asked if it was new, or if maybe my maps were just out of date. The man's smile widened slightly, taking on a quality I couldn't quite read. "Oh, we've been here a long time," he said. "But we're not always here, if you know what I mean. We show up when we're needed, when someone's in trouble and needs help. That's our purpose, that's what we do. We're the last chance for a reason." The explanation didn't make much sense, but I was too grateful for the fuel and too focused on getting back on the road to question it too deeply. I finished filling my tank, went inside to pay, and found the interior of the building just as vintage as the exterior, with old wooden shelves and a cash register that looked like it belonged in a museum. The man followed me in and took his position behind the counter, still wearing that enigmatic smile. "That'll be $87 for the fuel," he said. "And can I interest you in any snacks or drinks for the road? We got a good selection, things you won't find at those big chain stations." I browsed the shelves while he rang up my fuel, and he was right. The selection was unusual. There were candy bars and snack foods from brands I remembered from my childhood, but hadn't seen in years. Sodas in glass bottles with labels that looked decades out of date, and other items that seemed to come from different eras entirely. I grabbed a few bottles of water and some snacks, paid with my credit card, and was heading for the door when the man called out, "One more thing before you go. The road ahead, the one you're planning to take, it's closed about 20 miles from here. Washout from a flash flood last night took out a bridge. You'll need to take the detour. Go north at the next intersection instead of continuing west. Just follow the signs and you'll get back on track eventually." I thanked him for the warning, made a mental note to adjust my route, and walked back out to my truck. But when I climbed into the cab and looked at my GPS to plot the detour, something strange happened. The gas station, which should have been right behind me, wasn't showing on the map. According to the GPS, I was parked in the middle of an empty field, with no structures or facilities anywhere nearby. I looked in my mirrors and could see the station clear as day, but the GPS insisted it wasn't there. I pulled out of the station and headed down the road, and when I looked back after maybe half a mile, the gas station had vanished completely. Not faded into the distance like it should have. Not gotten smaller with perspective, just gone like it had never existed at all. I told myself it was the heat playing tricks on my perception, that maybe the building was positioned in a way that made it invisible from this angle. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something impossible had just happened. The detour the man had mentioned was right where he said it would be. A clearly marked road closure with signs directing traffic north. I followed the detour for about 10 miles, winding through increasingly remote country, when I started to feel like something was off. The road I was on wasn't showing on my GPS, and the landscape didn't match what I expected to see based on my maps. I should have been heading generally north and then west, looping back to rejoin my original route. But the sun's position suggested I was actually heading south and east, going in completely the wrong direction. I decided to turn around and backtrack to the main highway, but when I tried to reverse my route, I couldn't find the road I'd come in on. The intersection where I'd turned simply wasn't there anymore, replaced by unbroken prairie with no sign that a road had ever existed in that location. I continued driving, looking for any landmark or road sign that would help me orient myself. And that's when I saw the gas station again. The Last Chance Fuel, sitting beside the road ahead of me exactly as it had been before. But I knew that was impossible. Knew I hadn't driven in a circle. Knew the geometry didn't work for me to have ended up back where I started. I pulled in anyway, confused and getting worried, and the same man emerged from the building with the same friendly smile. "Back so soon?" he said. "Have some trouble with the detour?" "Yeah, it can be a bit confusing if you're not familiar with the area. Tell you what, let me give you better directions." I explained that I'd followed his directions exactly but had somehow gotten lost, that my GPS wasn't working properly, that I needed to get back to the main highway and continue to Nevada. He nodded sympathetically and pulled out a paper map, one of those old folding road maps that nobody uses anymore, and spread it out on the hood of my truck. "Here's where you are," he said, pointing to a spot on the map that didn't correspond to where I thought I was. "And here's where you need to go. It's not as straightforward as you might think. The roads out here, they don't always stay in the same place. They shift and change, responding to things most people don't understand. You have to know the tricks. Have to know which roads are stable and which ones are fluid." He traced a route on the map with his finger. A complex path that twisted and doubled back on itself in ways that made no sense geographically. "Follow this exactly," he said. "Don't deviate, don't try to take shortcuts, don't trust your GPS or your instincts. Just follow the route I've shown you and you'll get where you need to go eventually." I studied the map, trying to memorize the route, and noticed something disturbing. The map itself was changing, roads appearing and disappearing as I watched, town names shifting, entire geographic features moving around like pieces on a game board. "What is this place?" I asked, fear starting to override my confusion. "What's happening here? Why do the roads keep changing?" The man's smile faded slightly and he looked at me with something that might have been pity. "You're in between," he said. "In between the world you know and the world underneath it. The one that exists in the spaces and gaps. Most people never notice it, never see it, just drive through without realizing they've crossed a threshold. But you noticed, you paid attention, and once you notice, it's harder to get back. The roads here respond to intention and belief, rather than simple physics. They go where they think you want to go, or where they think you need to go. And those aren't always the same thing," I wanted to argue. Wanted to insist that this was all impossible. That roads don't move, and gas stations don't appear and disappear, and maps don't change while you're looking at them. But I couldn't deny what I was experiencing. Couldn't explain away the evidence of my own senses. "How do I get out?" I asked. "How do I get back to the normal world?" The man folded up his map and handed it to me. "Follow the route I showed you. Believe that it will take you where you need to go. And most importantly, don't stop again. Don't pull over. Don't turn around. Don't second-guess the directions. Every time you stop, every time you change your mind or try to correct your course, you sink deeper into the between space. Keep moving forward with conviction and you'll find your way out." I took the map, got back in my truck and started driving, following the route he'd outlined even though it seemed to take me in circles and zigzags that made no rational sense. And all along the way, I kept seeing that gas station, the Last Chance Fuel, appearing at intervals along the route, sometimes on the left side of the road, sometimes on the right, once even appearing ahead of me in the middle of the road before dissolving as I approached. Each time I saw it, the man would be outside, watching me drive past, waving encouragement or sometimes pointing to indicate which direction I should turn next. This went on for what felt like hours, but might have been minutes or days. Time having lost all meaning in this strange space where geography didn't follow normal rules. I saw the same landmarks multiple times from different angles, drove through towns that appeared and disappeared, crossed bridges that spanned rivers that weren't there and then were. And through it all, the gas station kept appearing, kept marking the way, the man always present to guide me deeper into or out of this maze of shifting roads. Finally, after what my clock insisted was 7 hours, but what my sense of time suggested was much longer, I came over a rise and saw normal highway ahead, real pavement with regular markings and signs, other vehicles traveling in both directions, a landscape that matched my maps and GPS. The transition was sudden and jarring, like passing through a membrane, and when I looked back the way I'd come, there was nothing but empty prairie with no road visible at all. I pulled over at the first real gas station I found, a big chain place with multiple pumps and a convenience store, and went inside on shaking legs. The clerk asked if I was okay, said I looked pale, offered me a chair and some water. I asked him how far it was to the Last Chance fuel station, described its location and appearance, and he looked at me with confusion. "There's no station by that name anywhere in this area," he said, "and there hasn't been an independent station on that route in at least 20 years. Everything's been bought up by the big companies." I checked my credit card statement on my phone, looking for the charge from the Last Chance fuel, but there was nothing. No transaction recorded, no evidence that I'd ever stopped there or paid for fuel. But my tank was full, showing that I'd definitely gotten diesel from somewhere. And in my pocket I found the paper map the man had given me, now showing normal, unchanging roads, but with a route marked in fading pencil that showed the impossible path I'd traveled through that between space. I've driven that route many times since then, always during daylight, always with a full tank of fuel, always making sure I don't need to stop for any reason. I've never seen the Last Chance fuel station again, never encountered those shifting roads or that helpful man with his enigmatic smile. But I keep the map he gave me in my glove box, a reminder that the world is stranger and more fluid than we generally acknowledge, that there are places between the places we know, spaces where the normal rules don't apply and geography responds to need and belief rather than simple physical reality. And sometimes, when I'm driving through particularly remote areas and my fuel gauge starts to drop toward empty, I see something shimmering in the distance ahead, a building that might be there or might not, and I always make sure to fill up somewhere else, somewhere normal, somewhere that will definitely be there when I look back in my mirrors, because I'm not ready to return to that between space, not ready to sink deeper into those shifting roads where the Last Chance fuel station waits for travelers who've noticed too much and can't quite find their way back home. The thing crawling beneath. My flatbed from Big. I'm a big guy, hence the name, standing 6'5" and weighing close to 300 pounds. And I've got a reputation for being tough and fearless, for handling any situation without flinching, for never backing down from a challenge or showing weakness in the face of danger. I've been in bar fights and survived accidents that should have killed me. I've driven through natural disasters and kept my cool when other drivers were panicking. But there's one experience that broke that fearless reputation. One night when I discovered something living beneath my flatbed trailer that made me understand there are things in this world that size and strength and courage can't protect you from. It was early March, Still winter in the northern states, and I was hauling a load of construction equipment from Minnesota to Montana. Big heavy machinery strapped down on a flatbed trailer. Everything secured with chains and binders according to regulations. The weather was cold but clear. No snow or ice to worry about. Just that bone-deep chill that comes from high-pressure systems and cloudless skies. I was making good time, enjoying the drive, listening to music and watching the landscape roll by under the stars. Around midnight, somewhere in the middle of North Dakota, I stopped at a rest area to take a break and do my required walk-around inspection, making sure the load was still secure and nothing had shifted or come loose. It was a small, basic rest area with minimal facilities. No other vehicles present, just me and my truck in a pool of dim light from the overhead lamps. I climbed down from my cab and started my inspection, checking straps and chains, looking for any signs of wear or damage. I was at the front of my trailer, examining a chain that I thought might be loose when I heard a sound that made me freeze. There was a scraping noise, metal on metal, coming from underneath the trailer, right beneath where I was standing. My first thought was that something had come loose and was dragging on the pavement. But the sound was wrong for that. Had a rhythm and pattern that suggested movement rather than simple mechanical friction. I crouched down and shined my flashlight under the trailer, expecting to see a loose strap or maybe a piece of debris that had gotten caught on the undercarriage. What I saw instead made my breath catch in my throat and my heart start pounding. There was something there. Something large and organic clinging to the underside of my trailer. It was dark and glistening, covered in what looked like thick plates or scales, with multiple limbs or appendages that wrapped around the trailer's frame, holding it in place. At first I thought it might be a large animal, maybe a bear or mountain lion that had somehow gotten caught under the trailer, but the shape was wrong. The proportions didn't match any creature I'd ever seen. It had too many limbs, too many joints, and its body seemed to flow and change as I watched, like it wasn't entirely solid, like it was adapting its form to fit the space it occupied. And worst of all, it had eyes. Multiple eyes scattered across what I assumed was its head or front section, and they were all fixed on me, watching my light, aware of my presence. I backed away slowly, flashlight beam still fixed on the thing, trying to process what I was seeing and figure out what to do about it. The creature, if that's what it was, didn't move at first, just continued clinging to the underside of my trailer, its many eyes tracking my movement. I could see now that it had some kind of mouth or opening on what might have been its underside, ringed with rows of teeth or spines that were currently pressed against the metal of my trailer frame. My phone was in my truck, and I briefly considered calling someone. Police or animal control, or I don't even know who you'd call about something like this, but I wasn't sure what I'd say or whether anyone would believe me. Instead, I decided to try to dislodge it, to see if I could scare it off or force it to let go. I found a long metal pole in my truck's equipment locker and approached the trailer again, making noise and calling out, trying to intimidate the creature into leaving. The thing responded to my approach by moving, and the way it moved was horrifying, flowing along the underside of the trailer like liquid, always staying just out of reach of my pole, repositioning itself with unsettling speed and fluidity. It made sounds too, clicks and scraping noises, and something that might have been communication, or might have been just mechanical effects of its movement. But that sounded disturbingly purposeful, like it was trying to convey something. I realized that trying to remove it physically wasn't going to work, that this thing was too quick and too adaptable to be dislodged by simple poking and prodding. So I tried a different approach. I got back in my truck, started the engine, and began driving, hoping that the movement and vibration would convince the creature to let go and drop off. But as I drove out of the rest area and back onto the highway, I could still hear it underneath the trailer. Could hear the scraping and clicking sounds, could feel occasional thuds and movements that suggested it was still there, still clinging to the undercarriage. I drove for miles, gradually increasing my speed, hoping that the wind resistance and the bumps in the road would shake it loose. But nothing worked. The thing stayed attached, and worse, it seemed to be adapting to the movement. seemed to be getting more comfortable with the vibration and the speed. I could occasionally see it in my mirrors when we passed under streetlights. Could see limbs or appendages extending out from under the trailer, testing the air, exploring its environment. Then things got worse. I started hearing sounds from inside the trailer, scraping and scratching that suggested the creature was no longer content to cling to the outside, but was trying to get in, was attempting to breach the flat surface of the trailer bed and access the cargo or possibly the cab where I was sitting. The construction equipment I was hauling was heavy and securely strapped down, but there were gaps between the machines, spaces where something flexible and determined could potentially work its way through. I pulled over again, this time at a large truck stop with multiple vehicles and plenty of people around, figuring that the presence of others might deter the creature, or at least give me witnesses and help if something went wrong. I parked in a well-lit area and got out carefully, looking underneath the trailer, and was horrified to see that the thing had grown, or multiplied, or somehow become larger than it had been at the rest area. It now covered more of the undercarriage. Its body sprawled across multiple support beams and frame members, and it had definitely been working on the trailer bed, as evidenced by scratches and gouges in the metal that definitely hadn't been there when I loaded the cargo. Several other truckers noticed my distress and came over to ask what was wrong. I tried to explain, tried to point out the creature clinging to my undercarriage, but when they looked, they couldn't see it. Insisted there was nothing there, suggested I might be tired and seeing things that weren't real, but I could see it clear as day. Could see it watching me and them with those multiple eyes. Could see it moving and adapting and spreading further across the underside of my trailer. One of the truckers, an older guy with decades of experience, pulled me aside and spoke quietly. "Listen, son," he said. "I can't see what you're seeing, and I'm not going to claim I believe in things I can't see. But I've been on these roads a long time and I've heard stories. There are things that attach themselves to vehicles. Things that feed on the energy of movement and distance. Things that exist in the spaces between places. If you've picked up one of those things, seeing it is the first step. The second step is understanding that it can only affect you as much as you let it." He suggested I find a specific type of facility, a truck wash that used certain chemicals and processes that he claimed would remove not just dirt and grime, but also these parasitic entities. He gave me directions to one about 50 miles ahead, told me to drive straight there without stopping and to not look under the trailer again until I'd gone through the wash. "The more you observe it, the more real it becomes," he said. "The more you acknowledge its presence, the more power you give it. Drive like it's not there. And maybe by the time you reach the wash, it won't be." I followed his advice, got back in my truck and drove toward the wash station he described, forcing myself not to think about what was underneath my trailer, not to listen to the sounds of scraping and movement, not to look in my mirrors when we passed under lights. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done, ignoring something I knew was there, pretending that reality was different from what my senses told me. The truck wash was exactly where the old trucker had said it would be. A large automated facility that looked normal enough from the outside, but had symbols and markings around its entrance that I didn't recognize. Patterns that might have been decorative or might have been something else entirely. I pulled in and went through the wash cycle, watching through my windows as various chemicals and brushes worked over my truck and trailer. When I emerged on the other side, when I climbed down to inspect my vehicle, the thing was gone, not a trace remaining, not even the scratches and gouges it had made in my trailer bed. Everything looked normal. Looked like I'd imagined the whole experience, except that I had witnesses who'd heard me talk about it. I had the memory of that conversation with the old trucker, and I had the undeniable knowledge that something had been there, something real and predatory that had attached itself to my vehicle and tried to work its way inside. Since that night, I'm much more careful about where I stop and what my truck might pick up during long hauls through remote areas. I inspect my undercarriage regularly, looking for anything unusual, any signs that something might have attached itself. And I've become a regular customer at certain truck washes, the ones that the old-timers recommend, the ones that seem to exist specifically to handle problems that normal mechanics wouldn't believe in and couldn't fix. Because I know now that there are things that travel our highways without needing their own vehicles. Things that hitch rides on trucks and cars, feeding on movement and distance and the energy of travel, waiting for opportunities to move from outside to inside, from underneath to up top, from invisible to all too terribly visible. The town with no sounds except my engine, from Coyote Carl. They call me Coyote Carl because I'm a survivor. Someone who's learned to adapt to any situation, who can find food and shelter and resources in places where others would starve, who operates by instinct and cunning rather than following rules and conventions. I've survived breakdowns in the desert. I found my way out of situations that should have been fatal. I've outlasted storms and shortages and every hardship the road can throw at you. But there was one town, one absolutely silent town in New Mexico, that tested my survival skills in ways I never anticipated, that showed me that sometimes the absence of danger can be more terrifying than any direct threat. It was late May, already brutally hot in the southwestern desert, and I was hauling a load of solar panels from California to Texas, taking the southern route through Arizona and New Mexico because it was faster and avoided the mountain passes that would have added days to my trip. The landscape was classic desert, all red rock and sand and sparse vegetation, beautiful in a harsh and unforgiving way, the kind of place where mistakes can be fatal in survival. Depends on preparation and respect for the environment. I'd been driving for about 6 hours when I noticed my fuel gauge was lower than it should have been, probably due to a slow leak in my tank that I'd been meaning to fix but had kept putting off. I calculated that I had maybe an hour of fuel left. Certainly not enough to reach the next station I'd planned to stop at. So I started looking for alternatives, checking my GPS for any stations in the area that might be closer. The GPS showed a town about 20 miles ahead, a small place called Silence, New Mexico, with a population listed as 247. It indicated basic services, including a gas station, which was exactly what I needed. The name struck me as unusual, Silence, but I figured it was probably named after some early settler or local landmark, and I didn't think much about it as I continued driving, watching my fuel gauge continue to drop toward empty. The turnoff for Silence was well marked, a good paved road leading away from the highway and into a valley between two low mesas. I followed it for about 5 miles and the town appeared ahead, looking surprisingly intact and well maintained for such a remote location. There were houses and buildings in good repair, streets that were clean and properly marked, landscaping that suggested recent care and attention, all the signs of an active living community. But as I drove into the town, I immediately noticed something wrong. There was no sound, none at all except for my truck's engine and the rumble of my tires on the pavement. No birds, no insects, no wind, no distant sounds of human activity, nothing. The silence was absolute and oppressive, pressing in from all sides, making even the sound of my own engine seem muted and distant, like I was hearing it through layers of insulation. I drove slowly down the main street, looking for the gas station and for any sign of people, and found both the presence of the town and the absence of its inhabitants equally unsettling. The buildings were all intact, windows unbroken, doors closed properly, everything looking lived in and recently used. But there wasn't a single person visible anywhere. Cars were parked along the streets, some with their windows down, keys visible in ignitions, but no drivers. Houses had lights on, curtains open, furniture visible through windows, but no residents. The gas station was in the center of town, a small independent operation with 2 old-fashioned pumps and a garage bay with the door rolled up. I pulled in and got out of my truck, and the moment my feet hit the pavement and my engine went silent, the absolute nature of the quiet hit me like a physical force. I've been in quiet places before, remote deserts and isolated mountains where human sounds are rare, but this was different. This wasn't just absence of sound, it was like sound itself couldn't exist here. Like the air refused to carry vibrations, like the physical laws governing acoustics had been suspended. I walked to the gas pumps and found them functional, but requiring payment inside. The door to the station office was unlocked, and I entered, calling out to announce my presence even though my voice sounded dead and flat in the silence, falling to the floor without echo or resonance. The interior was ordinary, shelves stocked with supplies, a counter with a register, a coffee maker with fresh coffee that was still warm, but no attendant, no employees, no one at all. I looked for a bell or way to summon someone, but found nothing. I checked the garage bay and found a car up on a lift. Tools laid out, a repair in progress, but the mechanic had apparently vanished in the middle of working. I went back outside and looked up and down the street, seeing no movement anywhere, no signs of life in any direction. The town looked perfect and normal except for the complete absence of people and sound. I decided to check a few of the nearby buildings, thinking maybe there was a town meeting or event that had drawn everyone to one location, leaving the rest of the town temporarily abandoned. I tried the diner across the street and found tables set for meals that had apparently never been eaten, food in various stages of preparation in the kitchen, still warm, still fresh, suggesting that whoever had been here had left very recently. But there were no signs of disturbance, no indications of panic or emergency, just ordinary activities interrupted and left incomplete. The houses I checked were the same story, beds made or unmade, dishes in sinks, laundry in progress, televisions on and showing programs, computers active with documents open, all suggesting people who had simply stopped what they were doing and left without explanation. And throughout all of this exploration, the silence remained absolute. My footsteps making no sound on wooden floors, doors opening and closing without any creak or noise, my breath producing no audible exhalation despite being clearly visible in the cooler interior air. After about an hour of searching, I returned to the gas station, increasingly anxious and confused. I knew I needed fuel, knew I couldn't continue my trip without filling my tank, but I had no way to pay and no authority to simply take the fuel without compensation. I stood there in the silent street trying to decide what to do, when I noticed something I'd missed before. On the sign in front of the gas station, beneath the name and prices, was a smaller line of text that read, "Payment required before departure, no exceptions." The phrasing struck me as odd, particularly the emphasis on before departure, rather than before pumping or some other more standard formulation. But I was desperate for fuel and rapidly running out of options, so I filled out a slip of paper with my contact information and credit card number, left it prominently displayed on the counter inside the station, along with enough cash to cover the fuel plus a generous tip, and proceeded to fill my tank. As the diesel pumped into my truck, I noticed that even this normally noisy process was silent. No sound of liquid flowing, no click of the pump mechanism, no anything except the visual confirmation that fuel was transferring from the station's underground tank to my vehicle. I filled up completely, replaced the nozzle, and was about to get back in my truck when I saw movement at the edge of town. People were emerging from the buildings, dozens of them, the entire population of silence appearing simultaneously from houses and shops and offices. They weren't walking or running, more like manifesting, transitioning from invisible to visible without any apparent movement. And they were all staring at me. 247 people standing perfectly still, perfectly silent, watching me with expressions that were impossible to read. I got in my truck quickly, started the engine, which roared to life in what should have been a loud burst of noise but somehow remained muted and distant, and drove toward the exit road as fast as I dared. In my mirrors I could see the people of silence remaining motionless, watching me leave, and as I reached the edge of town, as I prepared to turn onto the road that would take me back to the highway, I saw something that explained everything and nothing at the same time. There was a sign at the town limits, One I hadn't seen on the way in because it faced outward rather than inward, and it read silence. New Mexico, founded 1953, site of America's quietest town, acoustic research facility. All visitors must pay the sound tax. And beneath that, in smaller letters, sound is currency here. We measure, we collect, we preserve. Thank you for your contribution. I didn't stop to ponder what this meant. Didn't slow down to examine the sign more carefully. Just kept driving until I was back on the highway. Back in the normal world where sound existed and functioned according to the usual physical laws. But about 20 miles down the road, I noticed something disturbing. My truck's engine was louder than it had been before, much louder, making noises and vibrations that I was certain weren't normal, that suggested something had changed or been damaged. I pulled over and popped the hood, expecting to find mechanical problems, but everything looked fine, perfectly functional and properly maintained. The loud sounds weren't caused by any malfunction. The truck was simply producing more noise than it should have, like it was compensating for something, like it was trying to make up for a deficit. And that's when I understood what the sound tax meant, what the town of silence had taken from me in exchange for the fuel. The town existed in a bubble of absolute quiet, maintained by some mechanism or process I couldn't understand, and it sustained that silence by absorbing sound from visitors, by taking acoustic energy from anyone who entered and stayed for any length of time. My truck had lost some essential quality, some acoustic signature that made it produce sound in certain expected ways, and now it was overcompensating, generating excessive noise to make up for what had been taken.